So you have actually given a TED Talk on AR and VR. I really consider you one of the thought leaders in spatial computing. Hasn't it mostly been hype so far?
Yes, we're a couple years out, but this is the closest we've ever been, particularly thanks to generative AI. People have been talking about this notion of walking around with your glasses and, being able to ask any question about anything you see in the world and understanding the backstory of a space or place that you care about.
All the experts I've talked to, like yourself, have a lot of praise for the UX and the interaction that the Vision Pro created. Yet it's basically a flop.
It's like the Tesla Roadster, right? Like, how many of those actually got sold? Would you consider it to be a commercial success? Was it more of like a status symbol thing? I wouldn't call it a flop as much as a really high-end developer kit that was positioned as a sort of high-end device that like the media consumption nerd in you would want to buy.
There are plenty of people who get no promotions in 5 years at Google. How did you manage to get 3 promotions in 5 years?
I always did the risky thing and I followed the craziest ideas when people were like, oh no, you should work on this area. This is far more strategically valuable. I was like, no, I'm going to go work on the thing that like I have a lifelong deep interest in.
Bilawal Sidhu, I've been following you on X for a few years now. We've been interacting on X. I can't wait to dive into this conversation. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. Likewise, big fan, longtime listener, first time dialer.
So you have actually given a TED Talk on AR and VR. You have a YouTube channel that's blown up in this space. You have a TikTok with over 1 million subscribers that people should check out. And so I really consider you one of the thought leaders in spatial computing. And what I have to ask is, hasn't it mostly been hype so far?
Ah, yes. The perennial, like how far is like AR, VR out? And it always feels like it's 2 to 3 years out and kind of has been for the last decade. And it's particularly funny that I say that, like, I've got my Snapchat's AR glasses right over here, which is supposed to be a glimpse into the future, but is kind of a dev kit right now. And really, I think the pithy way to think about the space is like that classic Peter Thiel quote: "The world of atoms is so much harder than the world of bits." I mean, we've seen such staggering advancements in the software world. But yeah, I mean, I've spent the entirety of my professional career effectively working in AR, VR since 2013. And every couple years, it felt like, oh gosh, mobile VR is the unlock that we need. Just once Gear VR gets out at scale, like people will be watching passive VR media, and that's going to change everything. No, no, no. Actually, it's all about mobile AR. It's the phone in your pocket. You got to meet people where they are. And then all the advanced headsets along the way. I will say on the headset side, Meta has basically been like, carrying the entire industry while everyone else sort of slowed down their investments. Though, of course, we're seeing that change. Apple, of course, with the Apple Vision Pro. We're going to very soon see something from Google. They've been teasing out their XR platform with the work that they're doing with Samsung. So I'm sure there's exciting stuff ahead. But even Meta, the clear leader, I think they have like 70 something percent of the market. It's like on the order of millions of headsets. That is just not a significant enough install base to make a difference, right? To create a thriving developer community, to attract even some of the bigger brands and the bigger IP holders to create content. And so that's why you're seeing the biggest players subsidizing this type of content, like you're seeing with Apple TV and the stereo stuff. And so I hate to say it, we're a couple years out, but this is the closest we've ever been, particularly thanks to generative AI and sort of the multimodal capabilities that we're always missing in the earlier iterations of the vision for the metaverse and spatial computing.
Say more about that, because it almost sounds like a tongue twister of trends when you say generative AI is helping AR and VR progress along. What is the role? What are the areas kind of within the value chain where it's helping?
This episode is brought to you by ADIO, the next generation CRM. Imagine a world where your CRM is powerful, easily configured, and actually intuitive. ADIO makes that a reality. As I've profiled in the Product Growth newsletter, setting up ADIO takes less than a minute, and within seconds of syncing your email and calendar, you'll see your relationships in one place, enriched with valuable data, including things like relationship strength. ADIO lets you build Zapier-style automations, create powerful reports, and works for any go-to-market motion, from PLG to sales-led. ADIO is designed for the next era of companies like yours. And companies like yours shouldn't have to deal with inflexible, one-size-fits-all CRMs. Join industry leaders like 11 Labs, Replicate, and Modal. Head to adio.com/product growth and you'll get 15% off your first year. That's attio.com/product growth. This episode is brought to you by WorkOS. If you're building a SaaS app, at some point your customers will start asking for enterprise features like SAML authentication and SCIM provisioning. That's where WorkOS comes in, making it fast and painless to add enterprise features to your app. Their APIs are easy to understand so that you can ship quickly and get back to building other features. Today, hundreds of companies are already powered by WorkOS, including ones you probably know like Vercel, Webflow, and Loom. WorkOS also recently acquired Warrant, the fine-grained authorization service. Warrant's product is based on a groundbreaking authorization system called Zanzibar, which was originally designed for Google to power Google Docs and YouTube. This enables fast authorization checks at enormous scale while maintaining a flexible model that can be adapted to even the most complex use cases. If you're currently looking to build role-based access control or other enterprise features like single sign-on, SCIM, or user management, you should consider WorkOS. It's a drop-in replacement for Auth0 and supports up to 1 million monthly active users for free. Check it out at workos.com/Akash to learn more. That's workos.com/Akash.
Absolutely. So, I mean, like, AI has been used in augmented and virtual reality for a while, right? Particularly computer vision. That's how these systems figure out like where you are in 3D space, like precisely locating you, understanding what's in your environment, and letting you interact with, computing using hands, for example, or other forms of gestural inputs, whether it's controllers, using hands, eye gaze, etc. So we've had that, like a mix of sort of classic AI and some, ML-based approaches. But I think the big paradigm shift that was missing was like just natural voice and being able to talk to the computer and give it context on what you're seeing and respond contextually, as it's become very trendy to say. I think that's the part where, like, in my head, there's this vision of sort of like a Jarvis-like AI system. And step one of it is, yes, I need to be able to do touch gestures. And oh my God, Apple nailed it to the point where, gosh, like sometimes when I take the headset off, I forgot I've taken it off and I'll find myself like pinching stuff on the walls. But I still can't talk to it and give it like just ask it questions about what I'm seeing. You see instantiations of this on mobile with something like Google Lens. Apple has started rolling this out in their Photos application. But once you can take that context of your video stream, your audio, throw that into these like massive context windows that these models have, suddenly you start seeing something that feels like a helpful assistant that like has full context, not only into your prior digital life, but also your physical surroundings. And that to me is just super exciting. And I think we're on the cusp of being able to do these things that would have been way, 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 way harder in the future. Just to close it out with one concrete example, in AR, people in science fiction, people have been talking about this notion of walking around with your glasses and, being able to ask any question about anything you see in the world and understanding the backstory of a space or place that you care about. That was a traditional content authoring problem like 2-3 years ago, pre large language models. Now you can start creating this type of content procedurally on demand without having to create a bunch of this like offline curated authored content. And so I think like Google's Project Jarvis is a great example or a glimpse of what is to come. Of course, Meta is doing very similar things on the other end of the spectrum, taking their Ray-Ban glasses and putting like the smallest, teeniest version of Llama on there so you can ask some basic questions. But you'll see those trends converge for sure. And that's why I think generative AI is going to be huge. Not just on the perception side, though, also on the not just on the creation side for these type of real world experiences, but also 3D. If you think about the metaverse, like if we go back to the Matthew Ball instantiation of like super, extensive definition of what is the metaverse, and you let's say break it down, it's to the spatial 3D spiritual successor of the 2D internet that we know and love. Well, hey, the 3D world is massive and it's empty and it's one hell of a canvas, but it's not much use if you don't have the means to populate it And creating 3D content has been so hard. So the level of democratization we've seen on the video side, some of the 3D scanning stuff, and the convergence that's going to happen therein, we finally have the means to populate the so-called metaverse as well. And so that has me very bullish about the future of spatial computing, especially as it gets a boost with all of these generative AI technologies.
All the experts I've talked to, like yourself, have a lot of praise for the UX and the interaction that the Vision Pro created. Yet it's basically a flop. Why?
I think it's like the Tesla Roadster, right? Like how many of those actually got sold? Would you consider it to be a commercial success? Was it more of like a status symbol thing? You know, the first thing I'll say is like I agree. There's like not that much to do on that device yet, especially because they're seeding a new ecosystem from scratch compared to Meta, where you've got the Quest ecosystem, but you can also tap into Steam VR, which has been thriving for the last like almost decade now. And so I wouldn't call it a flop as much as a really high-end developer kit that was positioned as a sort of high-end device that like the media consumption nerd in you would want to buy. Oh, it's like your connected living room. Oh, are you thinking of buying like a 65-inch, 75-inch like OLED TV? Why don't you get this thing instead? And you can watch 3D content. And gosh, it's amazing for things like that, where they are subsidizing it and doing strategic deals. For example, I had a chance to watch the first, Dune in 3D before I watched Dune 2 in cinema. And it was fantastic, like amazing media consumption device, amazing second screen experience. But all the apps are kind of not there yet. And so I think this is like, it reminds me a lot of the first iPad and the first iPhone, where when the first iPad came out, people were like, yo, this is just like a larger iPhone. There's not much to do. It's like, kind of blown up iOS apps until people really started taking advantage of the form factor. And so I think we'll get there. But, you know, where I think Apple did mess up, because I don't love everything about it, is this thing is freaking heavy. And even for somebody like I have pretty much all the VR headsets, other than perhaps some of the Chinese ones. Like, I need to do a third party mod so I can actually wear it in a fashion that it's comfortable. And a lot of people do that, like, which is weird because they clearly went with like sort of form over function. And I don't know, maybe that's why all the rumors about the next instantiation are like a cheaper, lighter weight, maybe more plasticky device that doesn't feel so heavy and lopsided on your head. But this is classic Apple. They're dropping sort of like the creme de la creme, Tesla Roadster, and they're going to work towards the Model 3 and have no doubt that they'll get there. And these things that look like bulky, VR headsets will keep getting thinner and thinner until they look like a pair of ski goggles.
You compared it to the iPad. I feel like the iPad is something that actually sold. And you mentioned Meta. I feel like they've actually sold some headsets in this space. So I believe that both the Quest and the Ray-Ban glasses have outsold the Vision Pro. So tell me more about that. What is Meta getting right that Apple was getting wrong?
It's the price, to be honest. Let's be, like Meta is basically subsidizing this thing and giving it away. And they're seeding that ecosystem. And it's like a brilliant, I feel like Quest 2 particularly, and now Quest 3 and the 3S, like Quest 2 reached this threshold where, the biggest barrier to playing with VR systems was, oh, you needed a PC to really take advantage of it. You didn't really have standalone. I think Quest 2 reached that point where there was enough interesting applications on the market, on the social side, on the first person shooter side, on the media consumption side, even apps like YouTube VR that are glaringly absent from the Apple Vision Pro were available. So it became this like really cheap entry point into this beautiful ecosystem. And so you have this experience where kids that are in like VR chat or Rec Room and are playing on iOS devices see their friends jump in with VR. They're like, I want to get that thing. So that network effect has also been fantastic for them. And yeah, they've got like millions of devices, maybe even more than 10 mil total. And that's the largest install base, right? And so they're crushing it. So that's on the VR side. The Quest 3 is like a phenomenal device. I actually like gave away my Quest Pro recently because I was like, why did I even get the Quest Pro? The Vision Pro is the best high-end like workstation device. And I think like in terms of the closest console facsimile or proxy, like an Xbox that you can just buy and there's cool stuff to do, no doubt it's the Quest. And it's only going to get like, better because the 3S is like this cheaper variant that has the best of the Quest 3, which is itself phenomenal. And so I expect that to, only grow. So they seeded the ecosystem. They did a good job of building the stuff that they want to sort of, start creating their own sort of install base, having missed the mobile era, as people like to say. But at the same time, they've reversed a couple of controversial decisions earlier on where, initially you could not use Steam VR and some of these desktop VR applications. They wanted to lock it down so that you had to use like this Oculus app on your PC through their store. They've reversed that stance, and I think it's been for the better. And you're seeing the same thing on the other end of the spectrum play out, of course, with like open source AI, but also their glasses. Though I would argue, I mean, Zuck's on record saying this, the glasses were a surprise for them, right? Like Bose had in the markets these sort of like, really lightweight Ray-Ban looking glasses with pretty decent, just audio and microphone inputs, no display. And I think with a combination of the Ray-Ban aesthetic brand, whatever you want to call it, I got the first gen and the second gen, and I love them both. And it has effectively replaced AirPods for me. I don't use AirPods when I'm taking calls, when I'm walking around doing like convos with ChatGPT or Claude to get my ideas down. That's the device that I use. But I think even Meta is surprised how well that's done. And just this past week, I was reading some headlines, total rumor mill, about how they may be like taking away some resources on the VR side to push more on the sort of AR side. And that makes sense. I think they've got a great barbell strategy. You've got the desktop tethered, desktop on your face kind of equivalent, standalone VR headset. And then you've got the lightweight, ambient, always on, take it everywhere with you experience as well. And they've shown something in the middle of that spectrum with Orion, the $10,000 pair of glasses you can't buy, but is a really good tech demo, as where this might be going. But I think for the time being, you're going to have these two separate device categories. And gosh, Meta's got a strong contender in both. I'm actually curious to see what Apple's going to do for the lightweight form factor. I was expecting that's the route they'd go down first. But no, they built a rather bulky headset, even though T-Pain, I guess, tried to make it seem cool. I don't know if it fully did, had the impact that they might have thought it would have.
Let's move on from Apple and Meta to Google, your former employer. One of your hottest takes when I was researching for this episode was that you're still bullish on Google. I think so, because at least for me and, the top 5% of new tech users that I daily interact with, search is not something we use at all. ChatGPT, Claude, Perplexity have fully replaced Google. So why do you think Google can compete?
So it depends on which angle of like the Google business you look at, right? I think certainly there is more competition than ever before on the search front. Though I think people underestimate just how much mindshare Google has. It's that thing where like on Twitter, when you go look at those, like, maybe this is like some self-recursive loop that actually doesn't make sense, which is like you go on search trends and you just look at ChatGPT versus Claude, and it's like ChatGPT is just by and far out ahead of Claude. Like, who's actually using Claude? Like, I'm using it every day, and like perhaps in our, like, as you mentioned, like this early adopter community on Twitter or LinkedIn or whatever, people are, but vast majority of people aren't. In the studies I've seen, Gemini actually has great adoption, but that's not why I'm bullish. I'm bullish on Google because they have the most complete models of the physical and the digital world. And I think that's going to be a huge asset in this future, whether you want to call it spatial computing, whether you want to call it AR, VR, whether you want to call it ambient computing, whatever the term is, whether you want to call it like AI assistance, to make that assistant computing experience helpful such that it can actually help mediate all your interactions in the digital world and the physical world. I mean, Google's got all the pieces. Like, I'm talking about Google Docs, Calendar, like the G Suite set of products, my email, everything perfectly synchronized. All my stuff is on Docs already. Photos are where my images are. On and on it goes. They've got YouTube, which is like the second biggest search engine, and clearly perhaps the most complete repository of like visual content on the friggin' internet, right? Like all sorts of verticals that you might not even think about exist there. So when I think about that data mode, it's insane. Same thing with maps. Like, this is like my old world, right? Like satellite, aerial, ground level imagery that's fused together. Like, far outblows anything Apple's got, blows, Microsoft out of the water. And so I think like we're at this phase where everyone's building LLMs, scraping effectively the same data set, call it the public internet. I think as things slow down that we're hearing about, at least on the pre-training side, the same level of returns aren't being garnered with these larger training runs. And oh, we need to scale on inference time compute and other things. Well, even in those factors, Google has an advantage because they got TPUs. Like Apple is training a bunch of their models on, tensor processing units, like on all the TPU stuff, right? And so I think like the company that has the right consumer products, the right data modes, and the right sort of like ecosystem and distribution to get this right, to create that truly helpful Jarvis-like assistant, they check all the boxes. Apple does too, but then again, I don't know if they've got the same level of software chops as we're seeing, right? Maybe the ChatGPT partnership will just take them far enough. Gemini supposedly going to be in mode in there too. But all these things considered, I feel like people forget that what you see on about Google is like the tip of the iceberg, and the deeper you go, it goes down to like undersea cables and last mile infrastructure to get you that YouTube video at super low latency fashion, which let Google do things like cloud streaming and Stadia. Now, a bunch of these products, do well. Some of them fail abysmally. Notebook LM being a great example of like, an amazing like moment for Google. But gosh, like that is one hell of an ecosystem to play with. And if you're a startup, gosh, you better pull like an open AI if you really want to compete. So all those things brought together make me exceedingly bullish on Google still.
I can agree with most of those things, especially like YouTube and Waymo, where I almost feel like, the future earnings of Google are there's this point like 3 years before Instagram took over Facebook where we could all tell Instagram was going to become the more important part of Meta. For me, it's like I can already tell like YouTube and Waymo are going to become more important than search, because what Google has consistently shown in the AI race over the last 2 years is that it's almost a year behind Claude, which is, like 3 to 4 months ahead of ChatGPT in terms of user experience. Like Gemini is a usable product, but I don't know anybody who's extensively used the 4 major models, Meta, ChatGPT, and Claude, who's using Gemini. The only people I know who are using Gemini are people who haven't really tried the others extensively.
I don't know. I mean, like, I agree with you on like the Waymo point, and I also same thing for AlphaFold as an innovation, right? Like there's a subsidiary company that's set up around, basically drug discovery now. I mean, I don't think we priced in the impact of all of these, offshoots that can come out of, sort of the Alphabet portfolio. But personally, Gemini is like maybe not the best. Like, it's not my like daily AI assistant on my phone. That's like definitely Claude, ChatGPT as well. Sometimes, though, it kind of varies. If I'm using like advanced voice mode, I'll go to ChatGPT. But me and a lot of creators, like especially for our podcast on the TED AI show, we're using like Gemini extensively in AI Studio because of the 2 million, token context window. The fact that it is multimodal in, and you can drop in like the MP3s of all the recordings. You can drop in like a bunch of producer notes, my own notes, and kind of get this synthesis across modalities. It's kind of wild. And for the YouTube stuff too, like, or like short form video, hey, what's like the best hook to pull? I want you to like watch this video. And it gives you really, really good feedback and answers. And so it's funny, like AI Studio is technically this like sort of dev tool that's like for you to try stuff before you use it. And I find myself using it a lot because I can upload multiple audio files, video files, a bunch of images. And that's the way I tend to use it, is for summarization and querying over very large data sets that I can't do with something like Claude. I have to keep starting a new goddamn conversation periodically. Yeah.
Yeah, Claude is unusable from the client right now. They just cap it way too early. Okay, so for their specific use case, it seems like Google is ahead. And I do buy your point that like the ecosystem is pretty interesting. We know that TPU performance of TPU data centers is a lot behind NVIDIA data centers, but they could eventually catch up to an NVIDIA data center. They obviously do have that last mile infrastructure. So I see your point. I see the market cap there, but I have to agree with the overall kind of trends we've seen in market caps where Nvidia and Microsoft are kind of whipping Google right now.
They're crushing it. I mean, like, who's really making money in AI? It's like Nvidia, right? Like, everyone's got to pay the Jensen tax. Yeah, you may use TPUs for like inferencing, like your inference workloads, but you're probably going to do your pre-training on like, an Nvidia cluster, right? And so I think like, I mean, they're absolutely crushing it. Microsoft, on the other hand, it's interesting. Like, I've got some friends that are doing cool things there, and I chat with them periodically. But personally, I don't use Copilot, and I don't know anyone who actually does too. It's like, and there's of course the whole funny thing we could talk about here, where like the Salesforce CEO has just been like hammering Microsoft Copilot in his tweets. I don't know if you've seen this. It's hilarious. So, of course, he's probably got some like competing product offering to plug there. But yeah, it's like Microsoft is seemingly making all the right moves, but in terms of actual product stuff, like remember like 2 years ago, like when we probably first connected, like everyone was like, Google's dead, Bing's gonna be the thing. Who is going to Bing? Like, nah. And meanwhile, the relationship with OpenAI has become like kind of, there's like a bit of more of a frenemy dynamic than there perhaps was in the past. And I mean, back to NVIDIA, the fact is any company that wants to be successful, back to just like the scale that you need to win right now, at least the platform and infrastructure layer, is like you need to partner with a hyperscaler. So just like this past week, I saw another AWS partnership with Anthropic, and I was like, oh, finally, maybe we'll get more quota so we can like actually talk to Claude every day. Meanwhile, Microsoft, despite all their epic wins in this new division, I don't know. I find Copilot to be like a shittier version of advanced voice mode. I want to like it. But maybe it's like, I don't know, like maybe it's super useful for people that are on Teams and Outlook all day. And it's like the equivalent of if you're in the Google ecosystem and you're using Gemini. Maybe it's good enough. Maybe 80% as good as the frontier model is fine if it just meets you where you are. And you certainly are seeing this with things like Photoshop and Adobe, right? Where you've got generative fill in Photoshop. It is nowhere near the state of the art in painting that any other model, even like the old stable diffusion models, offer, but it's in Photoshop. So you go and use the thing, right? So yeah, those are my thoughts. I expect more from Microsoft despite their strategy, because on the product experience and like side, there's nothing that's like called out to me. Now GitHub Copilot, I need to go use it since the update. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's gotten better than Cursor now, but
Yeah, I think where Microsoft mainly won is by buying a lot of OpenAI. Let's move on to product management, which most of the listeners of this podcast are. And where I want to start is you actually landed a PM role at Google, which is very, very rare for people to just move into product management as kind of like your main title at Google. Usually when someone asks me, how do I break into Google? I tell them, yeah, it's a 5-year journey. You need to work at the companies that Google hires from. And Deloitte isn't one of those, but you moved from Deloitte. So I need to hear more about this story. How did you land the PM role at Google?
it's a throwback story. Let's do it. Yeah. I mean, I got very lucky with Deloitte too. I ended up joining their emerging technologies group. And this is right when all these like consulting companies were buying up digital agencies. So this is like 2013. I graduated college, studied computer science and business. Like, I was in a business fraternity. And so like, what are the things everyone was excited about was like the group think of like, you go into finance or you go into consulting. And at that time I needed H-1B sponsorship. Proud to be a citizen now, but back then it was more, said to be very safe. So I wasn't going and doing film and like working in 3D animation. Like that just wasn't an option, even though I minored in and that's where my head was. But given I had like duct taped together a weird disciplinary skill set, a creative technologist, if you want to call it that. Like I was a Google Glass Explorer. I'd already started prototyping with that stuff. I started playing with the earliest instantiations of 360 cameras. I'd started doing a bunch of like visual effectsy workflows to figure out like what do AR experiences look like. And that just let me do the funnest things at Deloitte, working on like IoT projects, drone projects, like a I don't know, a field service expert on an oil rig going through like a maintenance checklist. All the stuff, by the way, that's like still the things that have high ROI in AR, VR. And then when the DK2 happened, I really got into like consumer VR and game engines and 360 video. We produced a video for Deloitte at the time, like a training simulation video, essentially using like the earliest 3D 360 cameras. And doing that and doing soul searching, it came up to about 2 years. Got promoted quickly, had reasons to stay, but I was like, holy shit, this is the next computing revolution. Of course, it ended up being a longer journey than that because everything didn't blow up and pop off after 2 years. But I had conviction this is the right direction. And suddenly, all the other stuff that I had learned, like, and kind of it reconciled all these different facets of me, especially my passion for visual effects in 3D. I think of AR as basically like the visual effects pipeline running in real time on the phone in your pocket or the headset on your face. And so that gave me an opportunity to join Google in 2017, originally as like a technical producer. And so that ladder that they hired us on, they did no idea, like they were building out this new function called Daydream, now called Labs. Like, how do we even like hire for these type of people who know like technical stuff, but can do production stuff too? And they're like, oh, TSC ladder. So they tossed me in there and I just started doing a bunch of cool stuff that was inherently within the cracks of all the other functions. And so like, you obviously had product and engineering teams, you had some design teams, you had BD teams, and I ended up being sort of like the bridge and glue between them all. Like really close to the users in terms of, taking these camera systems and using them, I don't know, and like in production, like Teen Choice Awards, Coachella, Elton John, working with like the NFLs of the world, but also like top YouTubers. And then conversely, like being savvy enough about the underlying tech to shape the roadmap for what the engineering team should build next. Is like, yo, we need to build this thing. This should actually be interesting. And so I remember, one of my buddies now, like shout out Ryan Cassidy, hit me up basically being like, yo, dog, like, have you ever thought about being a PM? Because what you're doing is like the product manager role. And I, up until that point, hadn't even considered it. It always struck me sort of as like a boring sitting in meetings, writing docs all the time job. And surprise, surprise, there's definitely a lot of that. But, it was at this like nexus position where at least in Google, and this varies as you know, based on the company that you're in, Engine PM kind of run the show, like, and have a lot of autonomy and influence. And so, yeah, I basically like I did a rotation. I had a chance to take one of the things I was working on anyway. Is like, can I just like PM this part? Like the hiring managers and all those folks were super cool with it. Or I should say like the manager of that was super cool with it. I did that process and then I went through the conversion interview. So I got the same feedback that you are giving people, which was sort of like, hey, this is a multi-year process. You got to do it. And I was just kind of like in 2018 antsy and I just wanted to make the shift happen quick. I'm going to do a rotation, a 6-month rotation. I'm going to ship something that's demonstrated reps. And then at least at that time, you still had to go through the full loop of PM interviews to transition over. And so, gosh, it was definitely a several months of like, as you well know, the job of product management is very different than how you interview for product management. And so I watched a lot of the videos, read all the various books that you can imagine, and I just kind of bulldozed through it. And I'm glad I did. In fact, I wish I had done it sooner. So when I give people advice, and I've helped a bunch of people convert ladders at Google since then and mentored them, is like, don't wait for that promo. Don't worry about this thing. Just move on the ladder that you care about and do it as quickly as possible. Because after then, the world is your oyster. So that was my take. Kind of ending up in this like weird sort of, like one size fits all ladder. And later it was shared with me some of the highest transfers to PM and Google are from this TSC ladder, which I found very interesting. It makes sense. Like you get a bunch of people with some domain expertise and a smattering of things and you make it happen. So after that, I was hooked to the product thing, and that's what I did for the rest of my career there. Yeah.
I love this route. I now have a new sort of case study to talk to people about, which is essentially join Google in an area where it sounds like you're a domain expert. And so you don't necessarily need to join in the PM ladder, which tends to be a bit haughty-taughty about having needed to have been a PM before. You can join as a role that's kind of a virtual PM, which a lot of technical producer roles are, a lot of technical program management roles are. I mean, PM and project managers, it's not even clear that they're that different at big companies like
Especially
Google.
these days at big companies, right? Like I feel
Yeah.
like and even your producer point, like in the gaming and entertainment world, that producer role is so interesting. And even I just interviewed the director of DARPA, the program manager role is just very similarly like interesting. And so like even in like aerospace and like, like deep tech or whatever the trendy thing to call it now, there's this sort of bridge builder. I don't know how you think about the PM role because there's so many PM styles, like the colors of the rainbow, effectively. Um, but I think getting close to what you're doing, yeah, with like an area where you have domain expertise is so key because that's also where like then the engineers want to work with you, like because they're like, oh, this person actually knows what they're talking about, and like, actually, what are your thoughts on this? And so like that becomes a very good like you're just gonna make better product decisions if you understand the space better rather than approaching everything from kind of a generic MBA framework oriented approach, which I think, it's like a lot of PMing is turned into, unfortunately, these days.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Basically, there was a trend when I first joined product management in 2008 where everyone was an industry expert. And by 2018, it's like, it's like fashion too. There's just these 10-year cycles. You go from skinny to loose. It's like industry expertise to no expertise. Currently, the trend is towards industry expertise again for PMs. It's almost like a pendulum. Like you can just swing too far in one direction. So I land like firmly in the middle. Like you want some industry experience at least. More industry experience is better than none. But, you do see terrific PMs who switch industries as well. So don't let industry expertise silo your career and not allow you to achieve whatever you want to do.
And I'd also say, like, you can always go back. Like, I think a lot of people make it seem like a irreversible one-way door. And it's funny, like, a lot of the advice I got was, um, there was a time earlier around 2019 where I almost left the company to join a very large social media company, I'll say. And, like the feedback I got basically was like, no matter what you do, having this, ladder label, whatever, is going to be so prestigious that you might as well stick around and get your promo or something like that. And I did end up doing that for other reasons. But I think there's so many people that can go back to being an engineer, or like I did the PM thing, I didn't like it. Now you can go be a designer. Most of the stuff I did right out of college, despite having a CS and business degree, was like product design at Deloitte. And that made me useful there because like nobody else freaking knew how to do that. Everyone was like a wizard in Microsoft products, but they didn't have this other skill set. And so it's like but that still helped me as a product manager too, like, later on in my career to have those design chops and do it. And so I think when a lot of people think about like, oh, well, this role is like this title and like people overthink it, they're so much easier to like jump around. Now, if your goal is, hey, I'm trying to beeline the fastest path to, I don't know, like product VP or something like that, maybe you can't take as many detours. But I like to say surrender to serendipity, smell the roses, chase your passions, because when you're chasing your passions and not chasing a job ladder title or something like that, then that's all a means to an end. And then the end is totally worth it, even when you have to deal with all the, I would say, the less glamorous parts about product management, which people don't talk about as much.
What are those less glamorous parts for people who don't really understand what it's like to be a PM at Google?
Woo! I would say like it's like I describe working at Google to being like you're doing a tour on like the Star Destroyer, like the tanker ship. Choose your freaking analogy. It's massive. There's a huge chain of command. There's so many divisions. Everything is like hierarchical to the max. Yet the waves that you leave in your wake, if you can get the tanker ship to turn in the direction you believe in, you want, you're convinced is right for the business, there is nothing more satisfactory. But to do that, to get it may depends on what kind of team you're in. Like, I spent 4 years on the Google Maps team. Getting the Maps team to rethink how they viewed 3D and maps, it was like sort of like an exercise in applying the innovator's dilemma and the innovator's solution, kind of dealing with organizational change, finding out all the very respected people and getting them to change their minds. Like, that's not easy. It takes time. The visual analogy, it always struck me as sort of like you're a tugboat. Like, as a PM, you're sort of a tugboat and you're steering this massive ship in the direction that you want. But you need to align with other tugboats and like all orchestrate, coordinate together to go in a certain direction. So I think, like, as Alex Komorowski famously called it, his deck like hilariously leaked, the slime mold deck on like Google Culture, I think nails it, which is sort of like the coordination headwind is just really high. And so you're going to have a deep Rolodex. You're going to have to manage upward, downward, across, influence without authority. But again, like, if you're passionate, if you have a vision, what you're talking about, and you can make a reasonable, like, data oriented or just like product sense case for what needs to be done the way it needs to be done. People are very accommodative, because I find most people in these large companies are either like, like, there's a bunch of folks, there's a disproportionate number of folks that want to change stuff and get things done. So you got to find them and partner with them. But then there's a lot of other folks that are sort of like what Elon might call the managerial class now with the Doge thing, where it's like, oh, I got into the country club. My sole job now is to not rock the boat. Oh, crazy PM with crazy idea that will rock the boat. No, thank you. And I think you got to learn to take, like, you just no is not an answer. And you got to try again and again and work, dare I say, apply the 48 laws of power to go figure out how to get stuff done. But those are the downsides. Is like, it's a lot about moving hearts, minds, organizations, like hearts, minds, people's visions, processes to get stuff done. And a significantly smaller amount that's focused on the actual insight, doing the actual product work and getting stuff done. And I think that's why, like, larger companies you have to measure your wins on the order of certainly quarters, maybe even years, to have substantial impact. Whereas as a startup, the opposite of the tanker ship is the speedboat. Oh, like, we're going over here today. Oh, boom, let's go do it. No an onerous approval processes, no having to ask 5 teams for permission where they have like some dependency on your stack that was made 15 years ago. All this type of stuff you don't have to worry about, right? But again, the magnitude of the waves you can make are much smaller than the tanker ship. So I don't think it's glamorous, like, my style has always sort of been like that frickin' servant leader kind of style a bit. And I don't know, it's like, as long as you don't make it about you, but you're like able to go bat for people and like bat for what you believe in, you'd be surprised how much you can get that done in big tech. Cause I think, like, one other thing I hear a lot is like, oh, it's impossible to go do anything 0 to 1 or new in these tech companies. It's just not true. There's a lot of people doing it. They're just not going to follow the playbook that everyone gives you, perhaps by design, because the path well trodden, well, that's, homie, how you end up adding another button to your Google Cloud AI product.
I was in Google Cloud. I think we had some overlap. I was there 17 to 19. I'm curious, in the Maps team, what was the work environment like? At least in cloud, I think people would be surprised, but the engineers, it was rare to find them in the office at least after 4:30. I think marketing and sales evacuated by 5. PMs generally there till 6:30, often pulling virtual all-nighters before product reviews up until 4 a.m., going home for like a 2-hour nap and then coming back to get grilled by executives about something they hadn't even prepared about. I'm curious what it was like in the Maps team, and I believe you also spent some time in the spatial computing team, so
Yeah,
curious to
totally.
hear about both of those.
Sure. Yeah, I could start in chronological order. The AR VR team. So that was Clay's Daydream team, which then evolved into the Labs team, as we were discussing. That was very much like cherry-picked people from all the various product areas of Google that wanted to go build this next computing platform. And it was very much like, I would say, very PM heavy. There's a lot of PMs. Um, like, and yeah, like almost a PM to Eng ratio. I don't even know if I should share this. Yeah, so like I probably won't share it, but it was not great. There was just like way too many PMs, and there was like kind of the product surfaces were interesting, but there was only a few of them that like were like successful external facing products. So Google Lens is an example, or YouTube VR is an example, or AR Core as the AR platform on Android. These were like interesting things, and there were a bunch of other really interesting R&D, products and projects happening. And I kind of love that because like this is what I love about the tanker ship model too, is like basically it's like all these big companies, like whether it's Google or Meta, is like, yo, we just gotta catch all the Pokemon. And so like for any given field, let's just find all the foremost experts in all of this stuff, right? And so at the time, Paul Debevic, who did a bunch of like the light state stuff, was under Shahram Azadi's team. Shahram now is the VP of AR, VR, XR at Google. Really smart guy who did the Microsoft holoportation demo. It's like if you go type in Microsoft holoportation, this amazing video of like him doing a volumetric Skype with his daughter, like in the early 2010s, and it was just like mind-blowing stuff. And so these cats were around back then running like the research agenda. Paul was on these folks' team. And so like I loved it because there was so much cross-pollination all the time in all these domains. There was a lot of sharing. There was a lot of like team spirit, if you want to call it that. And of course, this was all like squarely in the office. So when I transitioned to PM there, even before then, getting access to all these people was easy, especially if you had interesting ideas. And like we're gonna go do something with this like big YouTuber or this like, big brand. Can we get some of your research stuff in there as a launch conduit for them? But then when actually being a PM, the way I structured my engagements was like I would always take one like thing that was like external facing launch had impact, like AR core feature. And then on the other side, I was like PMing all the volumetric capture and the 3D capture stuff on the research side. So helping them make sure their next phases of their like research agenda got greenlit. And that was the part like PMs didn't want to touch, too nerdy. What's the product impact? Blah, 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 blah. But yo, I had my like perf launch impact story locked down, working with like the actual like engineers that are going to like ship stuff. But then on the other hand, getting to play with the people that were really looking at the tech that then turned into neural radiance fields and 3D Gaussian splitting, all the 3D stuff you hear about today. In fact, a couple of those folks just launched a paper like earlier this week that's like making some waves in itself. So I love the vibe. It was amazing. I would say as a PM, it was still kind of tough, like given that there were so many other folks trying to find their bit of the map, and to launch anything interesting, you have to work with another established product area, right? So if like Lens, it had to be you're working with search. If it's YouTube VR, you're working with YouTube proper. Even if you're doing AR core, you're working with Android. Now some of these things have been consolidated in the future, but I love that experience. Very much felt like, kind of skunkworks type vibes. Contrast that with maps. So after doing 2 years of that, like I had an opportunity to keep working on stuff. Actually, funnily, of glasses there, which would have been an interesting, very long trajectory to get to what Google may or may not be announcing. Hopefully, in the next couple months. Maps was like timeless mission where Google, where like Daydream and Labs was like, well, what are we trying to do? Is it about AR? Is it VR? What is the future? There was a lot of pathfinding for that North Star. Whereas what I loved about Maps was like, we've got the most timeless mission in the world. It's like help people find things and get stuff done in the real world. And in the world that I worked in is like, our job is to map the world. Next year, we'll be mapping the world. The year after that, we'll be mapping the world. And a decade later, we'll still be mapping the world. And there was just a much larger, more established team, a lot more. By the way, I don't know, you look like you want to jump in here with something. If you want to, feel free to. Okay. Yeah, I mean, like a lot of lifers, like the people, I read this book called Never Lost Again, which was written by Bill Kilday, who's now marketing director for the Niantic folks. And this is like John Hankey and Brian McClendon, the folks the co-founders of Google Earth's predecessor, Keyhole. sort of what that turned into. I read that book and it was like early on is like getting to meet all those heroes. Like I was like, just like, I'm like, these are the people that have like done all these crazy firsts and all have very fascinating backgrounds from the private sector, from the public sector. You wouldn't imagine the breadth and depth of stuff that was happening there. And yeah, man, but it was very like different in the sense that there was like a huge consumer team that was solely responsible for consumer products and services. There was a huge enterprise team that did all the enterprise stuff. And then there was a huge like platform team that built and maintained the map of the world. And of course, a huge operations team, which was responsible for, I mean, like one of the draws to the job to me is like, was like the hiring manager at the time was like, yo, dog, like, do you want to go like make glasses that maybe launch or do you want to like move satellites around in the sky? And I was like, huh? Move satellites around in the sky? What are we talking about? It's like literally there's like teams that are orchestrating, tasking for satellites. There's like so many people know Google has Street View cars and Trekkers, but very few people know Google owns its own fleet of airplanes. It licenses a bunch of imagery too. So it's just like the world's most immaculate sensor collection, kind of operation and mapping operation on the planet. And to go from like doing AR, like for fun, whimsical things, oh, like, so and so launched some cool things with it, awesome, to like, yeah, YouTube VR videos and like, oh, we can scan like Simone Biles for the elections. How like, or sorry, we can scan Simone Biles for the Olympics. How cool is that? For how cool is that? To, oh, we're creating the next generation 3D map of the world. And by the way, do you want to be the product lead for that effort? And it was a no-brainer. I loved it. And yeah, it was like getting a PhD in maps over the next 4 years while getting to ship a bunch of cool stuff.
Okay. The Maps team, I feel like, has very puzzling product decision-making processes. So I need to hear more about like how this vision, strategy, and roadmap is created. Because just like as a user, I think if anything, I feel like the Maps product has like taken some features from Waze and made them worse. So like yesterday, my wife searched gas stations along the route and it chose some place called gas station an hour away. And the um the performance in low data is pathetic compared to when the iPhone came out in 2008, when like we had no data whatsoever and it would just download the map. Now downloading a map, insane. Like I live in like, for some reason, a low data area, and if I leave my house it takes me like 30 seconds to download a route to a place, versus my Kia, which no one would think is like a good maps, like it just pulls it up right away. So I was curious, like, how are they making decisions there? How are they prioritizing stuff? It doesn't seem like a Apple style product culture where quality is like always maintained on the things they're launching.
Oh, that's quite a scathing commentary. I know exactly the PM who'd be responsible for this, and you should maybe bring him on the show and talk to him about it. Because I think, like, I mean, quality is huge. It's very data driven, especially for things like this. That said, it is so incredibly hard to build a product experience that scales to maps to 2 billion users now and works in all the regions the way it should be, the way you'd expect. So there's a lot of nuances that, perhaps don't get addressed when you're trying to build for such a massive canvas. My personal gripes with maps and some of the things that, I would like to see change certainly are like, there is certainly a very cluttered UI. It is extremely cluttered. A lot of unification has happened. Like the stuff that's closest to the world that I care about is like, the way I view it is like, we've solved getting you to your latte in your gas station. Like that's a solved problem, whether it's maps, or Apple Maps or whatever it is that you end up using, right? You can do that. The things that only Google can do, like, especially given this like visual spatial model of the world, is where a lot of my interest was. But even in that world, as I went through looking through some of the older product decisions, I found that a lot of, I won't single out maps for this, but a lot of billion user product surfaces, there is a path where, essentially there are high impression surfaces in these products, and you can plop whatever freaking feature into those high impression surfaces, and you're surprised people are going to click on it and you're going to get engagement. And so a part of me feels like, especially with search and maps, because search gets a lot of the similar criticisms of like sort of bloat in different senses, is like, I think it's a problem of incentives where it's so easy. It's like, well, what have you shipped? You know, and like, what have your engineers shipped? And what is your, like, for the director of that team, what have y'all, like, as a portfolio shipped? And you got to have these like wins. So you take all these roof shots, going back to the Alex Komorowski, roof shots versus like moonshot thing, because of all the coordination headwind, because like, holy crap, we need to turn out like, I don't know. Let me give you an example of like landmark based navigation where like I want navigation to happen where it's not based on in 300 meters, turn right, but take a right at the Denny's or whatever. But to do it in a fashion that works everywhere, it's so much effort. How do you measure the data quality for that? And like the data quality efforts and like launch quality efforts were immaculate. I've seen so many things get rolled back because the initial signs weren't good as you're doing your percent ramp. You have to do experiments. So like, despite all of that, I think for these established companies that have, let's say, hit some degree of like feature completeness, where every other feature is a vitamin, it's no longer a painkiller. You do have this culture of like rotating, features that just aren't all that to get people on the promo train. And then you deprecate that feature and some other feature pops up and on it goes. And that was like, I would say one of the aspects about product management, especially at big companies, that I dislike the most, because that's kind of the game that a lot of people are playing and that what people encourage other people to play too, because it's such a well-designed playbook. It's like, oh, let's manufacture a metric that may not even matter and then move it. And yeah, you moved a metric, but did it matter to what end? Rather than moving metrics that matter. And so, yeah, those are my thoughts on it. I think like Google has, as a product, has gotten a lot better. Their rendering stack is way snappier now than it was previously. Um, it was getting very kludgy, the rendering stack across web, native, iOS. And so from what I can tell, at least externally looking in now, um, Google Maps is a lot more popular in iOS than it used to be. And the features like, live view, so you can like search what you see with a camera, and immersive view, so you can preview a place, are really exciting and popular and people love them. I still think if somebody went through the Maps UX and like remove 25% of the buttons, it would be a better product experience. I still think that there's still, but that's like Google product design aesthetic versus other, products as well. So I've certainly seen, even on the design side, some very talented designers go back and forth. And at some points, maybe what I'll close by saying is it runs into this weird problem of like, Google Earth had this issue too, but like Photoshop or Premiere, in the sense that you built this product that so many people are used to working a certain way. Like, how do you not alienate those users while still making it attractive to the next generation that say might be like, well, I get Apple Maps as default on my phone. Why should I download Google Maps? And I think that's very, very hard to do. To meet like your kind of incumbent user base, keep them happy, but still make substantial changes for the longevity and growth of a product, that bring new users to the party as well. And so, that's my take on maps and some of the struggles with established, applications. But hey, look at them. Still just crossed the 2 bill landmark just a couple weeks ago. And so there's no, which I was like super excited to see, because as Prabhakar stepped down, they mentioned immersive view in there too. And I was like, oh, cool. Like in Prabhakar's legacy, he views that as like, one of the steps in the right direction. But hey, man, if I'm being honest, there are many more steps to take. And as I mentioned, I'm rooting for Google to take those steps.
So I heard two big main reasons there. The first, the perils of performance review processes for product managers. The second, needing to acquire new customers, competing against things like Apple Maps.
Yeah.
So sticking on the first, it feels like you really nailed the Google performance review process. 3 promotions in 5 years. There are plenty of people who get no promotions in 5 years at Google and are perfectly happy with that and are even considered as doing well. So talk to us about that. How did you manage to get 3 promotions in 5 years?
First thing was like not aiming to get promoted. That was the first goal, because every decision I made at the time, like even with, like going back to leaving AR, VR and coming to maps, so many people at the time are like, like these like directors and VPs that I respect that are like, hey, you've got a great network here. Why would you reset and start from scratch and do all those things? And what I found is that no matter what I was doing, even within maps, I followed a similar thing where like, I started off on the platform side, PMing all the photogrammetry, like 60 engineers that were building and maintaining this map of the world and creating all sorts of like the imagery that gets published into maps, Earth, the stuff for flood forecasting, the stuff that powers navigation directions, the stuff that powers AR and 3D. Like at some point, I wanted to keep moving. Like, I don't know, like I keep going back to this recent DARPA interview because I found so many parallels with how they view product development with sort of how I've implicitly viewed it and not knowing is like when you go to a team or you go to an area, there are crazy ideas you walk in with, but typically in 2 years, a year and a half, even like all the strategic surprise, like all the novel insights get sucked out of you. And then you need something new to like create the next set of insights because you don't want to end up being, or at least I never ended up wanting to be sort of like the person in the country club I was describing, which is like, oh, I did my things, I've got my like lapel of like medals and awards, and now my job is to say no to as many things as possible and maintain the status quo because there's more that can go wrong by like people trying new things than by maintaining just steady as we go. And so like I always did the risky thing and I followed the craziest ideas when people were like, oh, no, you should work on this area. This is far more strategically valuable. I was like, no, I'm going to go work on the thing that like I have a lifelong deep interest in. And oh, by the way, here's a bunch of other people that are also interested in this. And that like became the goal. And then also like been very lucky that as I was doing those things, my managers have always been so supportive to be like, yo, you're actually crushing it. Like, do we want to try this? Like, it may not happen, but why don't we try it? And so, like, a theme in my life, especially now as a creator too, is like, man, very rarely do I reach out about stuff. Everything is like kind of organic and inbound. And what I find is like, if you're putting out, you know, if you're putting out the message of like what it is that you want to do, you find the band that like, marry men and women that want to join you on this journey. But you'll also find like all the like the accolades and the validation follows after. And so, that's what I'd say as a starting point. I will caveat this on answer saying is like, as you well know, and many others would know, the promotion process is a gauntlet. And I think one of the other things that like helped a ton was just like, I never let my level define who I could and couldn't talk to. I think there was a lot of people that felt, even when I started out, like, I remember like my manager at the time was like, what? You went and got coffee with the VP? Like, how'd you get that meeting? I was like, I emailed them. Like, what do you mean? So I think like a lot of people put themselves in this box. And what I found that in many times in my career, being good at like just sharing, like you don't have to like make this again, if your goal isn't promotion, you're doing cool stuff you care about, you want to talk about cool stuff, you want to get them to unblock certain problems that they're best positioned to unblock after, I don't know, you've tried like finagling and senior directors to like align on a thing, which oh my God, those are the meetings I don't miss, though they are freaking hilarious and funny. um you want to just go find a more expedient solution. When you go do that, like those folks remember, and like you'd be surprised. They'll be down to help you out when perf season comes out and give you that peer review or whatever. And then that, like, especially for like the more senior promotions, that kind of like visibility, or you messaging your stuff, does the organization view it as important? Just all happens organically because you're not trying to manufacture the perf packet. You're trying to do the thing that you're doing, and all these other things then result in that happening. That said, if I could go back and have had Claude to write those promo packets, oh my God, life would have been easier. those were a painful few days every single time. And I always did it like very last minute. And yeah, that's my journey. It's like, I don't know if it's like a great lesson or example for anyone, to be honest. But if there's one lesson I would leave people with is like, please don't chase being a PM. Don't chase the title, the promotion. Chase cool products and experiences that you want to work on and launch, and ideally cool people you want to do it with. Because also when you're in the trenches, that L7, L8 Eng lead that you're in the trenches with is going to be there to bat for you, because like that's just how it works. And then it's not even a question that you're asking for their help versus the other game that a lot of people play, and I'd rather not even articulate it.
I'll draw out two lessons for people here. One is, and I noticed this about the content that you have too. A lot of your content, especially the stuff that has gone really viral, is what I'd characterize as very unselfish. It wasn't like super intentional, engineered for virality. It's almost like cool experiments with technology or cool art that you were creating. So it seems like throughout your career at Google and now your career as a creator, you're really good at kind of getting passionate about some sort of technology and becoming this creative builder around using it and actually showcasing its potential. And I think that's very, very hard to do. So I want to talk about that in a second, but I also want to draw out this kind of second lesson that I think is really interesting about how you do things, which is, I think it's the definition actually of agency, which is like not being blocked by your level. That's probably the thing that I think probably hurt me the most in my time at Google. Is I was exactly that person that you just described, where I paid so much attention to their level. So if I was X level, I would only communicate directly with people X plus or minus 1. I never thought to just like +2, just like willy-nilly, just grab a chat with somebody like that. And I think that there's a certain amount of confidence, but also driven out of the first lesson of your passion for technology that allows you and enables you to make such choices. So what do you think it is about you that is driving that? How can people learn from your passion about technology and apply that in their own life?
It's a really great insight. This agency point, somebody else brought it up too. I was catching up with my old business school teacher who had randomly reached out. The LinkedIn reconnects you have her. It's wild. I don't really have a way to describe it other than like, this is what I love about being a creator. It's like, it's so permissionless. Like, I don't need anyone's permission to share whatever the hell I want online. And I think even a lot of creatives, I interact a lot more with the creative side of the world now. And they have this thing where it's like, well, I'm going to take my pitch and I'm going to like go pitch it to this like new emerging AI studio. And one day let me do it. Then homie, just go freaking do it. But I don't know what it is. I think it's like conviction or belief in like the thing needs to be done. Like many times I would just could be like, hey, we have these assets. We could be doing this. Why aren't we? Can we talk about this? I'd ask questions like this. And usually, especially when I'd reach out to senior people, like, well, let me tell you, there's this like long backstory. And let me tell you about the time we launched 3D and maps and like, in like 20, whatever, like 2008 or 9 or whatever. And what happened after that. And I'll get the full background. And that stuff was always so helpful for me, because I think in order to be effective and have high agency in organizations, you need to know who the influencers and decision makers are. And they're not always the highest highest paid person in the room, which is very like, oftentimes it's like who the highest paid person in the room delegates or defers to for certain decisions. And in Geo, and like, it's a lot of these like area tech leads. These are usually like principal engineer plus type people that are just the domain experts. And so like knowing the map, the chessboard, or whatever you want to call it, is one piece of it. But then getting out as much institutional knowledge from them, because the moment then you have that subsequent convo, and you're not anchoring it in like, here's me, naive new PM that's like excited to change the world like every other PM, and then gives up. They see your persistence because you're trying again and again. And B, you're refining, like you're coming with context that they didn't expect you to have. And that immediately builds trust and credibility. And then people are like, yo, you kind of get the old maps. you also get where we're going, and then you can be one of those people that leadership looks to help those transitions happen. And I think right now is such an interesting time, if you do want to be in product and doing these type of things, to help, no matter what vertical you're in, connect the past to the present and the present to the unknown, and bring people along for that ride. And that's kind of how you articulated some of my creation stuff too. And yeah, man, like the way I'd like to describe my content, it's like, imagine if we were just grabbing coffee and I was showing you something cool. That's the vibe I'm trying to go for, to show something to you. I've tried some of the, oh my God, like XYZ thing is dead, and here are 10 examples thing. And some of them have gone viral, but I always feel very icky after I've done them, even though it's a part of playing the game. Maybe I need to go back to doing a couple more listicle threads, but that's the vibe I try to go for. It's like, I'm trying to leave something. And it's funny, I was catching up with this like really cool guy who works at Google Labs, used to work at YouTube. Shout out Tron. You should have him on the pod. I think he'd be great, by the way. Is basically like, when everyone is so stuck in their corner of things. So the other lesson I'd pull out is, if you have the broader view, if you can build a map of the space, and then you have like, you will undoubtedly have insights versus the people that are stuck in their little corners of whatever the hell. And so I don't know, man, like, I've been trying to articulate, when I was talking to Tron, like, what is my like vibe as a creator? What am I trying to be? And I think I'm still figuring it out, trying to reconcile these like three facets of my personality, which I can go into, the three dogs in me, as I like to call it. But really, the answer I come up with lately is like, I'm some weird combination of Marquez Brownlee's accessibility, Ben Thompson's Stratechery's like deep and strategic insight, and Corridor Digital's mad science VFX experiments. And those are sort of like the three facets I end up going to. I try to connect dots between them where I can, but it's usually very conversational. I won't try to patronize people, but I'll leave a nugget in there for the people in the know. They get something out of it too, which is what I appreciate about MKBHD. I love reading Ben Thompson's stuff, but I've shared it like in the past with like, Gen Z folks and APMs, et cetera. And they're like, what? This is like, I can't get past the first page. It's too dense, right? And then the same thing with experimentation. It's one thing to play with the tools and do the tutorials. It's another thing to play with four primitives that people aren't putting together in an interesting way. And the likelihood of something interesting happening goes up based on that. And that doesn't matter if you're building videos or like content like me, or software too. Because again, we have all these Lego bricks and they haven't been put together in the most obvious combination. And to go full circle back to like the Google thing, it's the same thing at these big companies. You'd be surprised when you go in and take a stock at like what's out there in Meta or Amazon or Google. There are all these primitives sitting on the pantry shelf that have not been used. And so, hey, if you got creative ways to use that to move the ball forward, I think, at some point, the mission is bigger than you. And that inherently gives you agency because you are convinced this thing needs to exist in the world.
An area you talked about in another podcast that we haven't hit on yet, but I think was an important part of your performance reviews, you tell me if not, was when you said, especially on teams where design resources were light, I got to flex into the technical side. Tell me more about that.
I've done like, the various types of product roles. I've done emerging platform like AR core type stuff, research PM. I've done platform PM, right? Like where you're like, you own a platform of data products and services that runs consumer applications, enterprise applications, and other stuff too. And then consumer itself. And so what I found is, when I was in that platform or research mode, PM, usually like, like the design VP ain't doling out a bunch of designers for the research teams or the platform teams. Like, oh, you build data products and services. The consumer teams have resources to build around. And so that was like the closest, like it gave me this superpower where like I knew the tech like the back of my hand. I've been doing this shit since I was like 11. All the stuff from graphics beautifully transitioned over to computer vision. That I got a full speed run on computer vision and AR VR. by the time I got to platform PMing on maps, like, oh, here's like a cool new data product that we made. It's like, well, guess what? I'm going to take this into Maya and like, whip up this like crazy cool prototype. I'm going to take this like off the shelf 3D reconstruction software, run it through our in-house pipeline to do some semantic stuff, throw it into this third process, Cesium, and other products that I ended up helping shaping partnerships with those products too. Basically let you go from like, this is kind of a neat idea, and come to the meeting the next week with like a bunch of real stuff to look at. And everyone's just like, whoa.
Trust isn't just earned, it's demanded. Whether you're a startup founder navigating your first audit or a seasoned professional scaling your GRC program, proving your commitment to security has never been more critical or more complex. That's where Vanta comes in. Businesses use Vanta to establish trust by automating compliance needs across over 35 frameworks like SOC 2 and ISO 27001. Centralized security workflows, complete questionnaires up to 5 times faster, and proactively manage vendor risk. Vanta can help you start or scale your security program by connecting you with auditors and experts to conduct your audit and set up your security program quickly. Plus, with automation and AI throughout the platform, Vanta gives you time back, so you can focus on building your company. Join over 9,000 global companies like Atlassian, Quora, and Factory who use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. For a limited time, my listeners get $1,000 off Vanta at vanta.com/Akash. That's VANTA.com/AAKASH for $1,000 off.
And I feel like that in Geo, I distinctly remember that first meeting I did this, where I did this experiment where I basically took like publicly available drone data on YouTube and like I automatically did 3D reconstructions from it. And the pitch was like, hey, we could scale our 3D coverage. There's a bunch of high impression POIs that are sitting out there. This was just an experiment and it didn't ship, to be clear. But to go from like that talking about the idea and like a couple of these really talented engineers being like, well, that won't work for like all these reasons. And then just showing up the next week with like, by the way, here's what I whipped up over the weekend. Everyone's like, it just changes the conversation. And so like, I think that's always been fun for me because again, visual effects to me is about blending reality and imagination. And my reframe on that on like product, like, visualization or product design is how can we show people a glimpse of the practical thing that we're trying to build, either building it for real or building it kind of like a pseudo vision video. And I think it's the same sort of thinking that you need to go through because many people, when they make a vision video, it's too untethered from reality. It's not exciting enough. And so there have been these like seminal vision videos, some that I made myself. Sometimes we'd work with a team and like even get agencies to help us out. A lot of companies do this for like new tech development. That was just a huge asset, man, because I could go from like that had of, okay, I understand the tech. Here's the other pieces that we need to, oh, here's like the product potential of this. And then to like, well, how might we even visualize this user experience? And if you can like just kind of in your head have like a version of the PM UX Eng trifecta, I think that's a damn near superpower. And now I find it so cool because like I ended up studying comp sci business, but did a bunch of VFX and product design, learned After Effects and 3D and all this crap. PMs don't need to do that anymore. Yo, if you got V0 cursor and, Figma AI, like whatever it is you're building, you can go from like the idea to a very concrete thing to react to. And so, a lot of people like to say prototypes over PRDs. I like to say, why not both?
I think that a lot of PMs are that's gonna sound like wizardry to them. They're so far from that world. They live like purely in the world of meetings and documents. They're not actually connecting tech together. They're not actually building designs. How can PMs kind of adapt that mindset and move towards that mindset? How did you do that?
Man, I think the first one has to be just if you're not working in a domain that you're passionate about, man, it's tough. Like, I get it though, right? Like, I have friends who view their jobs and are still PMs at Google, like very comfortable. Like, one of them just like moved to an IC L8 role because now Google does like IC directors basically. And it's like, it's just doing all this cool stuff and not all the management stuff. I think there's ways to carve that future out, but you can't do it if you're not like, I think where you have those superpowers and you have those insights and dot connecting is like we're on the weekend, even though you're not getting paid for it, you're like for your own self-interest and curiosity looking up this stuff and going through Google alerts and looking at what was happening on Twitter. Man, I lurked on Twitter for so long, basically until the start of last year when I started posting and when we started DMing at the start of 2023. It's like I never took that platform seriously. You've been crushing it, by the way. Hats off to you for both Twitter and LinkedIn. Like I've seen your rise. I would often see you mentioned on Blind too, Ben. It was kind of funny. It's like it's really cool. And it's like I'm like, now I know the guy. It's like hell yeah. But back to answering your question, man. It's like if it's just a job for you, you're not gonna have those like your mind in the shower on your walk isn't gonna be making those connections. And so I like to view it as find a problem space that's worth loading and keeping in your context window for a long period of time. And if it's not, I think there are other ways you can optimize that. Maybe you're building a thing on the side, focus your energy on like that side piece versus like the like your day job. Um, but it's also not that hard. Like you could go into Midjourney and like, oh, and especially Ideogram. I feel like Ideogram, like the PMs are sleeping on it for some reason. So Ideogram, ex Google Imagen folks, they got sick of the tanker ship, got on the speedboat. A16Z funded startup does phenomenal text rendition. And so if you're doing like mocks for UI UX design, yo, I mean, you need to take a look at Ideogram. But you could do similar things in Midjourney or whatever. And suddenly, like, I used to love doing this even at summits, even in 2022. This is like where there were internal models at Google. I just use like the internal Imagen models when we're debating things over summits. Like, oh, well, we've only got X amount of resources, and we can only fund this thing or this thing, and now we got to go into full like you're influencing people at that point. And so these artifacts I think are so useful because again, not only does it help people visualize, it helps people like come to the same page and then build on the thing with you, right? Like, and you could do that. Like V0 is super easy. Like my buddy Matt Wolf, one of the top YouTube creators, he's going crazy with V0 and like cursor stuff. So I think all of that if you're listening to this and you're like, oh, this just sounds so out of reach. I'm telling you, you're like one weekend crank sesh away from having like Ideogram, cursor, and V0 be invaluable assets to help you like do your product job better. And like you would be like so much of what we're doing right now is just like the tools are already there. People are just not taking advantage of it and applying it to their specific domains. People are just applying it to the stuff that gets like broadly friggin' circulated, which is like fine. But think of like your contextual knowledge, your problems that you're solving, and try to use these tools as a part of that product development lifecycle. I think you'd be surprised how easy it is to get in.
I think ChatGPT, 100% awareness, like you mentioned with Google search trends, Claude, something like. So I kept asking my audiences on my India tour, how many of you guys are using Claude? It was something like, 30, 40%. Ideogram, V0, and Cursor among the PM audience, I think it would have been one hand if I had asked them. So maybe we can walk tool by tool through them. How do people get started with the tool and what use case should they be using for it?
So let's start with Ideogram, right? I view that as like you're writing your 2-pager on what product you're building or feature you're building, or maybe you're even as deep as into your PRD, or you're thinking about the strategy of a space, or you just want to visualize an idea. What I find is it's very useful to use Claude, ChatGPT, or LLM of choice to write your prompts for you. You might even in that situation provide them some context. Like, here's some visual references. Like, you can upload 5 images into Claude, for example. Here's some, like a slide that I have in mind, like that distills my idea. Here's like a couple other competitive apps that I'm looking at, blah, blah, blah. Help me write a bunch of prompts to like, explore X, a design for your product, feature, what have you. And then just throw that into Ideogram and just see what happens. And then you can use the various like remixing tools. The InPaint, like they've got a canvas editor now where you can do all of this in a Figma style canvas and select specific parts where you can get even more into a flow state that you don't have to jump into Photoshop or wherever. That's kind of how I view Ideogram. Personally, how I use it right now is like packaging for videos. which is also important for like product folks is like, well, like, what does a landing page look like for this thing? Like, is this like a thing that people would actually click on? How do you test that? Go mock up a freaking landing page. And then you can toss that into V0 or Replit agent or whatever it is that you're using and turn that into a reel. So V0 is really good for like mocking up UI, like with code, like really good UI. It's not going to build the full thing for you. Replit agent is cool in that it'll handle the back end and all that stuff for you too. So if you want to just like in a couple prompts, get to a kind of kludgy but deployable app, Replit agent is a great starting point. Now, if you code, or you want to get into coding, Cursor is the way to go locally on desktop for sure. Super easy. And there's like a bunch of guides out there. I particularly point folks towards McKay Wrigley, does some great writing on it. My buddy Riley Brown has also started doing some good stuff on it. And Riley's journey is particularly interesting because he calls himself like he's completely oblivious of the tech background world. And so he's like, I'm a senior software composer. That's like the thing that he's developing. And I was like, I don't know, man. That just sounds like product designer, like maybe like a design savvy PM to me. But I think like proof is in the pudding. You've got a bunch of these folks that had never written a lick of, code. Like we're making TikTok videos, we're doing like marketing, and are now building out web applications for themselves for the purposes of facilitating a conversation at your workspace, at your workplace. I mean, the bar is even lower. So that's kind of how I think about these tools is like, one more thing I'd say is like, I find it very helpful to use Perplexity for research. I'm actually doing this right now for a company that I'm advising, building context on the space, doing competitive analysis rather than going to your product strategy team and waiting for them to take a month to get back to you with here's what we think about the landscape. No, you should build your own map of the landscape. And now the tools to do that are so much easier. I would find myself previously when I was on my personal device, I'd just be like sharing links from iOS to my like work email. I was like, you read this, this is the thing. And then at some point in some block, when I wasn't sitting in a, long set of meetings, I would go start building some loose connective tissue around the background research. So you build a map of the space too. That's really helpful context. Going back to Gemini, especially these larger models, or even giving it to Gemini to start, say, hey, can you distill this down into 2,000 words? And then tossing that into Claude as context when you're doing your prompt iteration for what to pull out of V0 or what to pull out of ideogram. Yeah, those are some ideas. But yeah, I mean, this is like, there's so many other ways to use these tools, but hopefully this will give you a concrete starting point.
So ideogram is going to get you your mockups, it sounds like. V0 is going to get you your prototypes, and Cursor would get you like an MVP. Is that a fair mapping? Okay, so for the full stack PM, that's how you think about it. And traditionally, full stack PMs only exist in startups, but you kind of exploded that by bringing the full stack PM model to Google. And I feel like that must have been one of the key factors in your promotions. So how do you manage your time at Google? Because I feel like I was just overwhelmed with just the meetings and the PRDs. How did you find time for these extra full stack activities?
It's funny. I was like, shout out to the guy who told me that I should be a PM, Ryan Cassidy. When I was asking him for advice on like leaving Google, he was sort of like, and I was like, oh, but like I've got this, like a really good gig and like, promos around the corner and all this other stuff. And he's like, you don't actually have one gig, you have 2 gigs. And then you're doing a 3rd gig on the side. And so I think I was always a bit of a workaholic in the sense that like, man, the thing I was the worst at, I don't know if this helped me, like, is like, I get bored very easily. So I always needed to be doing like at least 3 high priority things. And then like can have like 3 or 4 like things on the back burner that I pop up the stack when needed. And I think that diversity of having like 3 high priority things with different groups of people that are different levels of risk just kind of made it like always fun for me. And so, I mean, I don't have a better answer than, dude, I was a workaholic. I absolutely worked like, 12, 13, 14-hour days, a lot. I think that was a shock to a lot of people, especially in maps where, like in Daydream, in the labs, now the labs team, there was a lot of culture of people, startup mentality, like we got to work. In Maps, everyone's like, yo, like, we Gucci, man. We got a billion users. Like, it's all right. Like, it's okay. Whatever you're thinking of doing isn't going to like make a huge splash. And I think that almost made it easy for me because so many people were like, oh, I couldn't possibly do something ambitious enough that would be interesting as like a geo level priority that people weren't even pitching the ideas that they had. Meanwhile, me, man, like I found this like very good, I would say, you know how people say you should have like a hobby that keeps you in shape, that makes you money and blah, blah, blah. I feel like there was two sides to my coin whilst I was at Google. There was the, hey, I'm a product manager at Google building stuff, you know, connecting the physical and digital worlds, and then my personal version of that was I'm blending reality and imagination with visual effects. And so I'd always be, even when I moved on to maps and we were doing some cool AR stuff, like we launched the AR Core Geospatial API, just freaking awesome. Used like, Gorillas used it to turn like downtown, like, Manhattan into a freaking music video and do a bunch of other cool stuff. And, like, I don't know, it's like the thing I'd be so deep on a set of facets of this problem during the week that when the weekend would come around, it's like, oh yes, Saturday morning, I'm gonna get my cappuccino and I'm a bit of a cigar aficionado, not the best habit, but I was telling you that nicotine caffeine combo Saturday morning, I would have like an idea for a video that I wanted to make using two new tools that came up. And even though I'd moved on from the AR VR stuff as the day thing, I was still playing with all these tools. I got into like early access for like TikTok's Effect House. It's like I think I'm still in the top 1% of like, like AR creators on TikTok, which is kind of wild. And so it was like I was recharging while still learning things that adjacently apply to the day job. It's like, oh, I'm learning about like real-time computer vision with all the AR stuff doing on the weekend. So when I go during the week and we're doing large scale, world scale offline computer vision, there's still a lot of insights to be gleaned from that. And I don't know, man, like that's kind of how I viewed it as like I lived and breathed this stuff. I don't think I took work-life balance like as a priority, and I didn't need to because I just enjoyed it. Now, one thing I will say that helped me be much higher leverage is like I got much better at saying no to meetings and skipping a bunch of crap. I think every PM goes through this phase where like, especially if you're doing a bunch of initiatives, you'll always have touch points and like, I've like been fortunate to work with some stellar PGMs, but other times there's just syncs for the sake of syncs. Trying to figure out when to pull out of those had been huge. And the last thing I'll say is morning times were sacred. Like that's when I did most of my product thinking is like just getting up early in the morning. I usually had to talk to this engineering team in Zurich. And before that, I would just like, do my important thinking for the day. I tried reading Make Time. I tried reading 4 Hour Work Week. And to be honest, there were still many days where I had a litany of meetings that never ended and I stacked them all together and it's probably not healthy. And PMs are probably the only PMs and engineering managers, really managers in general, are the only job function that will just do like 8 meetings back to back, and it's just like be eating your lunch in the meeting too. And in retrospect, a lot of that was unhealthy. And I think I could have done a better job of spacing things out. But gosh, man, I was just so passionate about what we were doing that it was easy for me to do that. And then the weekend was just like a treat to flex this adjacent but still relevant side of the problem. And so during the week, I'd be awful at creating content. I wouldn't. And that's why I love shorts. And for the first, I would say, especially, I started making content in 2016, but when I was really balancing both worlds, especially during COVID and stuff like that, short form video was the right content format for me to be able to do something interesting enough in a couple hours and get it out there and get that full satisfaction. Versus trying to do what Mark Rober did. He was like working at Apple and he was doing these long form videos on the side. Like, God bless him. Like maybe he clearly wasn't a PM. Maybe it would have been harder if he was. But yeah, those are some thoughts. I don't have anything crazy other than like, man, I just love this shit and I can't not think about it. And that was the problem. So like even when the workday's done, like at night you're scrolling Twitter, those are the things that I'm like looking for and sharing and searching and all that, right? So
All our B2B PMs might feel left out, but I think the real thing here is, just try to find some love about what you are building, where like even if you are building for some persona you'll never be, and you can't feel like you can't get passionate about your product as passionate as Bilawal is. I think that you want to, what I love about your work, especially like if people haven't seen your shorts, also like a lot of the shorts, these are true AR shorts where like they'll be like in the real world and then there'll be some crazy rendering inside of there, right? Uh they're like creative work products. They're like the type of thing I would expect coming out of a product designer. So it also feels like you didn't take the product management role so like narrowly as some people do, where you really blended a lot of design and engineering into it, which I think is a glimpse into the future of PM.
I think that's a really good observation. I feel like that's a glimpse into a lot of job functions are going to turn into this like sort of generalist specialist, if you want to call it that, where you're maybe the conductor of the symphony, but you know how to play a couple of instruments in the orchestra or have played some of the instruments, and they could be domain expertise too, not just skills. But even the B2B folks, like this is the part of Twitter that I do find funny, or X or whatever. It's like where people like are giving the B2B SaaS like startup founders like a lot of crap because they're so like, exuberant and like boisterous about what they're doing and how they're changing the world. Hey, I think more people in established and, like startup companies that are doing B2B stuff need to be, dare I say, as delusional about like the stuff that they're building as, you see some of these like kind of celebrity personality startup founders that are also doing B2B SaaS. I think there's so much to get excited about. Like, yeah, it's like people are like, there's a way to look at like video intelligence as being like, oh, this lame thing where you upload content to a CMS and like it writes captions for you. And there's another way to think about like how it fundamentally reshapes the world and lets you like convert video into structured data for so many different applications. And like, like there are ways you can get excited about it. And so like just find that spark of excitement, and you can't always relate to the target persona. Many times I couldn't, especially on maps, because you're thinking of a generic. Like if I was building something for like me, I'd like be working in Niantic and building out their Scaniverse app. Like that's for me, that would be like the ultra nerd type person. But I think like there needs to be whatever facet of it is, either you love working with the people, either you love like the tech stack or the associated technologies, you love the industry set of problems, or you just like, I don't know, like those are probably the three that come to mind. I think there's too many people that just run life on autopilot. And then I think that's where also the temptation to, one of the weirdest things about this experience was like, there's these people that I looked up to earlier in my career at Google. And some of them I'm still friends with, like that, like you said, like didn't, move as fast or didn't. And I always, when I would dig into why that happened, it was either lack of agency or it was sort of like, there's certainly a bad luck component. Some people can take on a project. Like if you worked on Stadia, you could have been the best PM. That project got axed. I'm sorry for all those folks. But then even there, like the folks that crushed it moved on, like, we're entrepreneurial enough to be like, you know what? I'm going to go build this exact thing at Magic Leap, and then I'm going to go be a VP at NVIDIA and doing the exact thing. It's like there are people that just, I don't have a good way to say this, and I'm trying to like load it, but like if you don't move towards something that you're passionate about, like you're just gonna go, you're gonna be far more likely to default to behaviors like, well, let me just figure out how to game my next promo, and you're gonna default into that. And I think like still there's some insights to learn from like how to play the processes and the game rights, but I don't know. For me, it's like if you're not excited about the thing getting out of bed in the morning, like then why are you even doing the thing? And why not find something else where you could do it better? And I think your life would be a lot better if you did it that way. Or, like I said earlier, then don't worry about put the day job into maintenance mode and find that spark somewhere else. But if you don't have that spark inside and outside work, you'll, I mean, I think it's going to be tough.
And then the other group that might be feeling a little left out is the parents who feel like outside of work, I really have no time. But I think there too, it's more about what I noticed about your work, 'cause like you said earlier, was the anti-promotion review culture. Like you weren't like, oh, I could get a promo here in this org where I've built this culture. You went in work to the areas you were excited about. It's about finding that excitement, that joy.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, it's also about like going to a place where other people think it's crazy and foolish to try things. I mean, you'd be surprised if you go to these incumbent organizations how many sacred cows there are. And what I mean by sacred cow is like thing that people view to be a truth that isn't actually true. And they're just like, well, we tried that back in whatever. And there's so many answers for things like this everywhere, right? Like, and it's all based on scar tissue and the things that have happened. And so I think going to a new place where, as I mentioned earlier, it's like once the strategic surprise has been sucked out of you, go do something else that builds new insights, and then you go to a new landscape, and then you try building new things. It's a lot of fun. I think like people get comfortable too easily. I think, and this is like we're hardwired from an evolutionary perspective to just chase security. It's like, well, I know this. I've worked with this team. Oh man, the VPs and those directors know me already. It'll be easier, blah, blah, blah. It's so easy to make that case. And it's funny, you're talking about parents. I remember, especially for moving to Maps, I remember talking to my mother at the time about this decision. She's like, no, beta, what's wrong with you? You gotta go. It's like, duh, you have to stay. And it's like, but then I look at her career. She's like a retired, bureaucrat, worked for the Indian government. Like, that's all she knew, right? So I think in this world now where you've got a bunch of these like kind of technopolar large players that are these like tanker ships and then a bunch of these speedboats, like these jobs, yeah, the market's getting tougher or whatever. But again, if you're passionate, that's why you'll stand out and you'll get to go work on something fun. So I think like learning for the sake of learning and cultivating passions is so much easier. Like even for parents, right? The fact that your research is now like after you put your kids to bed, sitting on your MacBook Air or your freaking phone on Perplexity and typing in a couple of queries and getting an answer that would have required you to do like 2 or 3 hours of like researching is insane. So I think there's so many interesting high leverage opportunities to discover knowledge and thus discover what it is you're passionate about, where you will stand out. Like my advice to people is like, if people aren't vying for telling people like your manager to be like, yo, I want this guy as RPM. Like, this is the guy. Like, that should be your goal. And the only way you can do that is if you can like level with what actually exists and demonstrate agency for going to get stuff done. You don't always have to be a visionary. To be clear, there are plenty of successful PMs that are pure operators. They're really, really good at recognizing an opportunity. May not have even come up with the insight, but then they can like rev on it. And those folks are very successful in large companies too. So, yeah, those are some thoughts.
Yeah, I almost think that's like the dominant archetype in these large companies these days is like the smooth operator, the lifer. You took the kind of more disruptive approach, which I think it's almost like a barbell strategy. Either you're going to flame out or you'll succeed a lot like you succeeded.
That's totally right. Yeah. I think I think it's like there's such few people that take that route that I don't think we have enough of an inclination of what happens if people purely, chased. Like, again, it also, I guess it goes back to how you measure success. If your success is like, I want to get to X level as quickly as possible, and that is the focus because your day job is like, I want to make a living for my family, and then you draw meaning, excitement, and passion from something else. I think that's a perfectly fine route, right? Like that just takes me back to all my friends who decided to go into finance. Like, all these IIT grad type folks that go into like, go be a quant or go do high frequency trading and stuff like that. they're not deeply passionate about it. Okay, maybe they nerd out about like, oh yeah, we're like repurposing some like naval era like satellite dishes so we can get like the latency for our like trade down even, further. Like there's that part, but largely it's like a means to an end. And then they're like, buying all the guitars possible, going to all the concerts possible, taking all the lessons. And there's like other ways you can find meaning. So it just depends. But I feel like if you can find that ikigai where it's both, and I always love the ikigai framework, even though it's really hard to find, like your ikigai, though, hey, toss a screenshot of that into Claude with a bunch of your conversations and context and like ask Claude interview you to find things like that. You'd be surprised, like, the stuff you can do. But that's the way I want to live my life, man. It's all got to somehow fit together. That is, I will say, a detriment to mine too. It doesn't all just have upsides.
So PMs are taking your advice. They're looking internally for that ikigai PM job. If they found it, I know you mentioned you've advised some people on these types of internal transfers and transitions. How do you go about manufacturing it? What are the step-by-step things you should be doing?
Great question. Yeah. And one thing I'll say is like cloud is getting hot lately. So like, I mean, I don't know if you've had Logan Kilpatrick on the show. He's like a PM in cloud, right? But he owns AI Studio, and that's putting him in like a very interesting position where like back when I was a platform PM, I'd have to go find folks like Logan to get my APIs launched, right? Like go find the, Google Maps platform enterprise PM or whatever. And so I think like those roles exist within a play like might exist within the product area you're already in, first off. Because I know for a fact, I mean, like cloud streaming for XR, that's something my old product Immersive View used. That's all sitting in cloud. There's a bunch of stuff there where customers are coming saying, hey, we want to do like a massive deployment of spatial computing. So getting close to those teams intra org is step one, the default. Figure out the map of where you're at. The next thing is like certainly at Google, and I'm sure the culture is very similar at like a Meta, is like little coffee catching up things. Like just but don't like say pick your brain. Every time I get that pick your brain message or some shit, I just like internal eye roll and my brain feels like somebody just like it's just like doesn't have much respect for the brain. But beyond getting triggered by the terminology here, this idea of like a coffee where you get to understand like you can MoMA search literally everything at Google, right? There's an internal search engine called MoMA. You can go look up what are all the other projects. You could go look at the full map of who reports to who, what are the teams, how many headcount like there are. And a few of these things have gotten closed off for more sensitive projects, but for the vast majority, the world is still an open oyster, at least so I hear. And so like take advantage of that and then go one or two, like either double opt-in with mutual intro. I've always been a big fan of that. You have somebody connect you. Hey, so-and-so is great. So-and-so is great. Y'all should grab coffee. Boom, usually get something scheduled, or just cold message somebody and ask them for their thoughts. And I think from there, like do a mix of people who are like ICs that are working on the team itself or in the area. So you get a better understanding for what's on the ground. And then also just hit up hiring managers, right? The folks that are managing those folks. And even if there isn't something right this second, something may open up in the future where then you're like uniquely positioned for it. Because, I'm sure you've heard this, and I think it's so true. The best jobs never even make it to the job description phase. Like they're like an email, they're like a short memo or something of what like people need to staff this thing. Very rarely does it go up into grow the internal job portal at Google and like certainly into, LinkedIn and some of the external facing stuff. Very different for engineering though, I feel like. Because in engineering, there's just more like maybe the more interesting roles are kind of like this. Maybe the manager roles are like this, but for product, so much of it is, like there's less of those jobs to begin with. And the ones that make it out there end up being sort of milk toast, blase, framework, Autobot regurgitator PM, which I don't know. I don't like those roles at all. So those are some pieces of advice. Just like do some scoping using the internal search, talk to some folks, and position yourself for something exciting. Many times doing like, sometimes you'll have a hiring manager that's like cool with you doing like a 20% project. where you end up actually launching something with that team. That's a great way to build a relationship. That's the way I retained my relationship. So when like I moved over to Maps from AR Core from the Daydream team, I owned like a bunch of 3D stuff, including visual positioning system. And I made the pitch for like, we got to launch VPS as like a consumer facing product, ran into all the same stuff of like, we've tried this before. Here's why we didn't launch it last time, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. Safety concerns, security concerns. Yes, you can hack through them one by one, but a huge part of making that possible was building a partnership with the AR core team, the AR VR team, Clay's team, and having a really good ally there in Eric Lai, my PM counterpart. And then we were basically like joined at the hip to make this stuff happen on both sides. Him handling like the AR core distribution, like, getting exec alignment over there, me figuring out all the map stuff, the enterprise stuff, the safety stuff, the data products, the scale, what are the next feature sets. And like that kept that open line of dialogue. I talked to Eric till date. I just met him like, talked to him like a month or so ago about the latest that's happening there. So I think like there's so many ways to take a dip in the pond, to survey the landscape, take a dip in the pond, and then make a more proactive step. And maybe the last thing I'll say, because this is cool, a lot of people do this externally. They'll get like 5 external offers, right? But they won't do the same thing internally. And this always blows my mind. It's like, nah, like if there's like 2 teams within the same PA that want you, in addition to whatever your current role is, and then there's 2 other teams where you could go here or there, you might end up carving out a more favorable. You're not going to negotiate tremendously on comp internally, but you're certainly going to be able to negotiate tremendously on scope. And as you move move up the PM ladder, a lot of it is about how much scope are you responsible for. So, I mean, those are all such underused things that people just don't do. Like, and when they do, like often when I'd get hit up a bunch being like, hey, like I looked at search you up in MoMA, I looked at the stuff you did there and the stuff you're doing now. Like, how do I like, do this stuff? And I'm like, well, like, are you excited about it? And there's like no excitement. They just like read that like spatial computing is going to be a thing and it seems kind of cool. And they're thinking about it, this one thing in addition to the 4 other areas that they are like interested in. So like, I don't know, man, like a lot of this just for me keeps going back to that thing is like, why product manage a product that you don't want to use or aren't convinced needs to exist? And yeah, sorry if that's like kind of I don't know if that's like the most practical advice, but that's how I genuinely feel. Because when you're doing this outreach and you're reaching out to folks, so like maybe the foremost expert, like I distinctly remember this convo, like talking to, like putting out this like deck on my thoughts on all the latest 3D reconstruction research and comparing it with other stuff. And this guy responded, Richard Zeliski is like wrote the book on computer vision all the PhDs read, right? And like, so I was like, paying for a bunch of my engineering managers to be like, yo, did you see like Richard responded to your email on that group chat? And like, that resulted in a great conversation with Richard and some insights that we incorporated into the product that we were building. But that wasn't from a place of like, let me go pick Richard's brain on like cool things that we can do. It was from a place of like, here's my opinion on things, but yo, like you're the OG dog. You probably have a lot more insights here. What do you think? And I think that like is such an interesting curiosity hook for people to help you too. So if I could make it practical, what comes to mind is like the same way you think about packaging a tweet or piece of content so that like people will engage with it. You got to think about the same thing when you're reaching out to these folks. And usually they'll still give you the time of day, but I'm telling you, the meeting will be so much more interesting if you don't start, well, I don't know anything about AR VR, but I'm just like really keen to learn about it. Or I don't know anything about 3D maps, but I tried using this one app. What can you tell me about it? What it's like? It becomes so boring versus like, hey, I've actually gone second. It's like O1. You got to do your O1 thinking time. Put some inference time compute going 2 to 3 levels deeper, then reach out to those folks. You'll have a more interesting conversation. And if they vibe with you, trust me, you will be in their head. Those neurons will not activate, be like, there's this person I talked to that'd be like perfect for this thing. And I've seen that happen so many times, not just for roles, but with cross-team partnerships. You go talk to that like hotels or travel team that's like swamped in like, a bunch of other stuff. They didn't have time, but you got them sufficiently excited that when their next like, summit came up, they're like, yo, we need something for like under 24 users that's visual forward. I remember a guy that I talked to, et cetera, et cetera.
All right, let's fast forward from product management to where I feel like you're one of the few people that are fully exploring the space. You've said generative AI is super cool, but I'm continually blown away with the work happening in procedural 3D modeling. Can you
Yeah.
walk?
Yeah. I mean, so generative AI, right? It has this slot machine kind of stochastic, kind of chaos to it, where you type in an image prompt, you'll get, a different image every time. You can lock down the seed. Okay, you're kind of getting the same image now. But really, you don't have a very effective means of like going from idea in your head to something on a canvas with fine grained control. And what I mean by that is like, okay, you made a mid journey generation, let's say. And I like, let's take the exact shot I'm looking at. You've got the mic, we got the bokeh with the acoustic guitars in the background, the posters, everything looks great. Like, oh, actually, I don't want the guitars there. I wanted there to be like something else. I want there to be like an LED wall of like, you know, like, uh, like a map of the world that's slowly rotating. Oh, I got to do like some manual in painting and then back to slot machine to get something right. Maybe you have something exactly in mind, or like, hey, I like your expression, but I want to change the expression slightly, or I want to change your t-shirt, or you were in this pose, you started here, I want you to be in this other pose. Now, all of that is kind of still solvable in image space and images when you're dealing with pixels. When you move that over to video, suddenly the problem's way more challenging. Holy shit, like how do you iterate on your prompt when you're doing like text to video? That's why I hate text to video. Okay, image to video. Your image is your starting point. That's how you exert control. But how do you define, oh, actually, I wanted the talent to walk down and sit on this couch over here, not on that couch over there. And oh, by the way, I don't like the lighting conditions for this room. I want them to be a little bit more moody. I want it to feel like a cigar lounge with like smoke filling the place. Every time you do those prompt iterations, you get a drastically different output. And so I call it this frustration of slot machine AI, where you're sitting there slot machining, you're the curator, then you're kit bashing things together, and on you go. When it finally comes to 3D, this problem is like multiplied to the max. And so the most interesting things I've been seeing is like before generative AI and sort of like diffusion transformer models were equated with Gen AI, um, you had this thing called procedural 3D modeling, which was also called generative AI. So architects use this to figure out how do I build a building that like has these certain constraints where I need these type of windows, I need this type of slanted roof coverage so I can put solar panels on it. You've got these constraints that you're giving the system and giving you flexibility to figure out the rest. So you exert fine grained control on the stuff that matters, and you use generative AI to take it all the way. That's what I've become very excited about, this sort of hybrid approach where kind of think of it like wireframing. If you're doing wireframing, sometimes you don't want to have a high fidelity prototype because it gets you thinking about aspects that don't actually matter yet at that stage. And so the equivalent of wireframing in the 3D world is called gray boxing. So in video game land, whenever people make video games, before you see the final visuals, like Doom built out, there's going to be this heavily gray boxed kind of low poly version of everything to get the mechanics right. Does this feel good? You could use like Pixar's like sort of like storyboarding, like nail the story in the storyboarding phase with visuals and audio attached to it before you go make the movie for real is a piece of that. And so I see this like beautiful confluence happening between these technologies where I had a chance to ask Jensen about this at GTC. He thinks every pixel in the future will be generated and not rendered. I think that's true. But I think underpinning it will be an explicit 3D scene graph. What do I mean by that? Whether it's an advertisement, let's say I want to author an advertisement for Volvo, and I want that creative contextualized for South Korean demographics versus Indian demographics, as an example. How do I author that content at this higher level of abstraction that almost represents like a wireframe or a document object model, such that I can lean on the creativity of these models, giving them very clear guidance on what to do, not just like twiddling and iterating on text prompts. Being able to do that with 3D is going to be a game changer too. So imagine this: on your browser, you'll have like a 3JS super lightweight 3D engine running that keeps track of the world that you're in. The 3D version of a document object model is called a scene graph. It's like, here are the characters. These are the characters in all my generations. These are the environments that I care about. Here are the rules of physics for the world. And you can attach interactivity to things in your scene graph. Awesome. Do that. I can move Akash to the left, to the right, exactly where I want. I got everything was a perfect take, but I need to change this one little bitty thing over here. Now you can do that. But still, for that final render, you can lean on the creativity of these generative models to get output that would have taken way longer to produce the traditional way, where you'd still be texturing the thing, you'd be lighting the thing, you'd be manually animating the thing. So I always find best of both worlds are very exciting. And something about this next level of iterative control is going to come out of this combination of scene graphs where you have explicit fine-grained control of the elements that matter with the creativity of generative AI models. And you're seeing earliest instantiations of that right now, more for like product photography. If like people want to put their like product on Shopify, but put a bunch of different backgrounds, you're seeing the very simplest version of that. But let me tell you, this thing's people are gonna pour gasoline on it, and movie making is gonna look a lot different by the end of next year.
Another technology that I've seen you kind of following the thread of more than others is NERFs. What's been happening in that space recently?
Totally, yeah. So NERFs stand for neural radiance fields. Think of them as a 3D representation that models the complexity of reality. It's a way of making photorealistic 3D objects and scenes. And what's cool about it is, gosh, just like the force multiplier and the democratization that's taken place. Going back to the AR VR team I mentioned too, I was PMing this like augmented perception team that was doing 3D capture. Back then, we needed these like crazy like GoPro rigs and like Yi cameras on a dome to volumetrically capture a space. And then you needed to throw this at like a Google data center to process. And in contrast, one of the techniques that have sort of stood the test of time, if you will, most of the 3D you might see in like Call of Duty or in Google Maps Immersive View or Google Earth or Apple Maps or whatever, is called photogrammetry. It's sort of the art and science of measuring stuff in the real world, basically taking images and even other sensors like LiDAR and using it to make measurements. Photogrammetry has been around since before computing was a thing. And basically, we reached a place, early 2000s, where like you could make a good GTA 2-3 looking model. That's the kind of best way I'd put it. Okay, I got a bunch of images of the world. I can like fuse all those images into this like cardboard cutout model where all the static structure in the world is perfectly like recreated. Amazing for skyscrapers, buildings, concrete structures. Awful for things on the ground. Awful for vegetation everywhere. Because all the vegetation in the world, if you still go look at Google Earth, will look like, these what we used to call broccoli trees. These like little like it's not what it actually looks like, but it's a good enough, abstraction of what's on the ground. Enter image-based rendering. There's these two separate tracks in computer vision. Photogrammetry, where you care about measuring stuff like what's the height of this building, what's the height of this curb cut, what's the like exact dimensions of this door, what's the flooding risk in this city. All these things you needed to measure stuff with metric accuracy. On the other hand, was sort of like 3D photos on steroids. And you might remember the earliest instantiations of this like being photosynth for the real nerds, if you remember that. But also in Facebook, like in 2018, they rolled out this feature where you could take a photo and then you could kind of move around and see a little bit of what's happening. Man, that line of research continued. We got something called multi-plane images that turned into multi-depth map images. But really in 2021 came out this paper called Neural Radiance Fields. It took this like age-old problem, kind of historically called like light fields. Like, how do I replicate all like the entire field of light that represents something like in my head, like all of the light rays that I'm getting, such that if I move my head around in it with a VR headset, for example, everything looks realistic. The reflections move, the glint, the veneer on your skin, the rim of your glasses, everything works perfectly. That ended up being like a really hard problem. Lightro tried to build a company around it and failed. Along comes like a bunch of Google researchers and Berkeley Research 2021. They come out with this paper and they're like, no, actually, this is way easier than you think. And we got this first time we got this representation where the complexity of reality could be represented by the weights of this multi-layer perceptron. This neural network got so good versus explicit triangle polygons, meshes representing the complexity. This neural network did a better job, but it still took a lot of compute, to play with. Back then I had to like beg for TPUs or like wait way too long to get to play with this stuff. But then like Luma dropped. Luma came out with a mobile app that let you do exactly that, where you're crunching stuff, you're capturing it with your phone. Now you've got a 3D scan of the spaces, places, and objects that you want to, capture something once, reframe it infinitely in post. You want to use it in your other content, you would throw it into game engine. You could start kind of doing things like that, but it was still like a data center in the cloud. Fast forward another year, Gaussian splatting came out, which again, this theme of old school meets new school. They took this like really old school concept of Gaussians, like a really like a way of it's an alternative representation to say triangles to represent stuff. Like this fog of these ellipsoidal splats called Gaussians. It's almost like, yeah, you're creating this like foggy rendition of the model, but also this OG physics concept called spherical harmonics. And you put it all together to basically create something that was like way faster to train than NERFs, but could render in real time in your browser. And so suddenly the same idea of radiance fields, they pulled out the neural bit. They made these non-neural based radiance fields that are amazing. Their music videos are being made with them now. People are embedding them as like product photography on their like on their product pages. And even more interestingly, the photogrammetry industry, which had traditionally been like, oh, these researchers playing around with their fun little, like research papers, are like, whoa, you're telling me this like works with the existing pipeline I already have for like drone scanning the world or doing all sorts of 3D reconstruction for Hollywood. And this is just one cool new artifact I can get out of that models the complexity of reality, is editable. That's kind of where we're at with the radiance fields. I'll stop by saying like I've got two cool videos on this 3D Gaussian splatting explained on my YouTube channel and what you can do with a reality capture, because you'll be surprised the various utilitarian and delightful applications of this tech. But fundamentally, man, I've been so bullish about this idea of taking observations of the world and turning it into 3D rendition that I think we've solved it for static scenes. And the next paradigm is volumetric animated 4D scenes. And I think we're not too far from that future either.
Super cool stuff. People have to check out the videos. So we talked about a lot of things that you have expertise in. Of course, you're the world's leading expert in yourself, and that's what I want to talk about next, which is all about your journey. And the first step of the journey that's really interesting that people always want to hear about is you're a PM at Google, This is for some people their terminal sort of, this is the thing they always dreamed of and wanted. But you decided to make the leap to creation full time. How and why?
Yeah, man, that decision took me a year to make. So, and it's funny, I was catching up with somebody who left Pixar and is doing a startup. And I always ask this question, and it feels like for most people, it takes them like 6 months to a year. There were several reasons. I think, like, personally for me, where I had a bunch of success, and the path was for me to be a manager. And I just started managing like APMs and like it was kind of fun, but it was also like I hated managing, to be honest. Like I did not enjoy it at all. And it's like there's many reasons for that. Like I don't know. I just like the way I'd put it is what I knew what I needed to do. I'd stopped learning new things. I could not find another thing within Google that was exciting me enough where I was like, hey, It's time to reinvent myself again. Let's go do this for another 2 years. And all the exciting stuff was happening externally in generative AI. So in 2022, it started playing with Midjourney V2 as it came out. I started obviously playing with all the instant NGP, the NERF research. At that point, we were like working on a NERF product to put into Google Maps. Immersive View, the indoor views in Immersive View are radiance fields. So there was some connection there, but all this other stuff like Midjourney and Stable Diffusion dropping and automatic 1111 connected with the like VFX creator part of me that wasn't getting as much of an itch. There might have been an alternate world had I not, there are times I decided to stay in maps too. I could have gone to YouTube and start doing a bunch of AR effects stuff. And at that point, mapping the world as that mission, so beautiful. I encourage, I feel like it needs more generations of people to go in with energy to keep reimagining it. So that's what I'll say is like, don't always jump if you get an opportunity. There are times where sticking it out makes a difference. And of course, your boy got promoted, sticking it out and pushing that stuff. But this VFX side was like, it became the sharded aspect of my personality. Oh, I make some shorts on the weekend. Yes, adjacently, I'm learning about some AR stuff. But the moment the generative stuff popped up, there was very little crossover with my day job suddenly. And there was all these interesting things happening between all like the LLM stuff. Like I'd started playing with GPT-3 before ChatGPT even came out and like had it try to write PRDs and stuff. Like it was kind of fun to see how bad it was back then compared to where it is now. Same thing with Midjourney. But I made my first video, I remember using Midjourney and After Effects. It's like, can I make a video that like mixes some of the generative stuff with some of like the stuff that I usually do in visual effects? I did the video in a fraction of the time and the video did great. Got like a couple million views. And then I started making similar tweet threads on Twitter where it's like, let me just try and kit bash some of these things together. And what I found is like, okay, do I want to go to this place where like I could stick it out at Google? I have to still like really be on, like, as you know me, as I described, I'm a workaholic. I can't not be a workaholic and do the 2 jobs that I was doing at the time. And at the same time, I know the way to move upwards is basically playing the 48 laws of power. And there's like organizational stuff that I would have to do to get there. And, like on the other hand, I look over the playground, everyone's just having fun with all this stuff. And my channels had become big enough by this point where I'm starting to get like sponsored gigs. Most of them Google didn't let me do. So for example, I got hit up by Amazon, be like, yo, we're trying to advertise The Boys TV show. Can you like make a TikTok video, just like visual effects? Maybe do something with airplanes. I was like, oh shit, this is like my bread and butter. Go create a guts ticket. Some person's like, oh, Amazon, we're like too deep with Amazon. Like you basically can't make this video. But I did get to do stuff for Autodesk. And I think you saw that video, the sponsored video that I did with Autodesk. That was like a light bulb moment for me. Because like many other people, by that point, I was like feeling like, oh, you know what? Like I could stay at Google forever was kind of the mindset. When that gig happened, and that was like maybe 1 or 2 months into me thinking about what do I do next? With a year taking me to like actually decide to leave. It's like, wait a second, Autodesk is paying me to fly me to go check out cool shit. And then they're also paying me to make this video about my life journey using their tool. Wait, this is a job kind of thing started happening. And that's when I started talking to a bunch of other creators in the space as well. And I talked to somebody who's like in an adjacent space to you. My buddy Ram Narayanan, shout out Ram, had hooked me up with him. So I talked to Nick Singh, yeah. And he was just like, dude, you are framing this up. Because at that point, my plan was like, hey, I'm going to keep building out this like creator thing on the side. Maybe I build out a little side team. I figure out how to keep minimal conflict of interest. I'll keep the Billy FX brand that's like external facing creators. There's Bilawal Sidhu, the personal, like, but that's all Google. I didn't want to even have a personal brand at that time. Talking to folks like Nick and a bunch of other AR creators like Don Allen III, who's like just on the meta stage doing a bunch of stuff, known that guy since 2018. Folks like it. I realized A, it's possible to do this as an indie. B, there's such few people who are actual creative technologists in this field that are doing it. And C, I could go back to big tech whenever the hell you want. Now I talk to some people, like I was talking to some folks who are working on AI efforts at big tech to keep it generic. Like, dude, I don't even know. I'm scared to leave to do YC because like I don't even know if there will be a job. And I'm again like, what are you optimizing for? Is it for the job or is it for the thing that like gives you spark and passion? And man, I remember distinctly was going to CES in last year that like I met up with a YouTube creator that I hadn't seen in a while, has like, I don't know, 8 million subs or something. And after that convo, all these other convos, like I knew what the next year was going to be. We had our roadmap locked in. I was like, something in me just wanted to take the leap, man. And it's funny, my manager at the time was super nice. And she's basically like, yo, dog, you got a lot of PTO. Do you want to just like take a month off and like just try it out and just see if you want to do it? Like, and I was like, you're right. And again, maybe this goes to why do you have a month of PTO left over, Bilawal? You're at Google. Isn't everyone resting, investing? Contrary to popular belief, there's a lot of people hustling. What percentage of people? I'll let the other folks debate that. Especially given the recent study, Stanford study, about 10% of engineers being ghost engineers. But that month was amazing for me because it was the first time my default network of the week was off. I wasn't in any meetings, and that's when I made some of the craziest. Like I don't know if you ever saw me reskinning my mom's living room in 3D thing. I made this like 3D scan of my parents' living room, and then I used ControlNet to restyle it to different styles of decor. Like it was just such a simple thing I cranked out in an evening and the next day to package it up, and it blew up. That was like my first 1.9 or 2K likes on Twitter. I had like 2,000 followers back then, so I was like small. And that gave me some content market fits, what do you call confidence as well. So after I lined up like just a few brand gigs that would like cover over, like I didn't want to end up in a situation where I leave Google and then I'm not making any revenue that year. As I had visibility into those things, dude, I dipped and it was the best decision ever. Maybe there's a world in which I should have left a year sooner. I think I could have been much further along, but then again, hindsight is always 2020. I got to ship cool things during that year that I wouldn't have otherwise. And so, man, that's what my transition for is like, and if there's something people can take out of this is like, it wasn't easy, it was hard. And I think one of the things that's really important to do is like be okay with not having it all figured out, being okay with like making yourself vulnerable and being upfront with people. So for example, I told my like manager at the time, it's like they immediately for some reason assumed I was going to Meta, dude. That was like their default reaction for some reason. And Meta does some funky things too, where at one point they like, I don't know if you run into this issue where they'll like they'll email you on your corp ID. And I was like, I gave what the hell? We talked, you've got my Gmail. What next? I got a ping from my like VP out of the blue being like, hey, I just want to say like we really appreciate the work that y'all are doing and all this stuff. And I was like, maybe that was a coincidence, but I don't think so. I don't think so at all. And so is like, but putting yourself out there and so like, yo, I'm not going for a competitor. I'm going to do this creation thing. I'm deeply passionate about it. It like changed that dynamic too. And like I was able to talk to so many other people far more openly. Even some of the folks that were a little annoyed that I was leaving is like because we were kind of on this journey together. That it just made it a seamless transition. And the fact that I had like been dabbling in the creation stuff for the many years prior, and specifically in the AI stuff the year prior, gave me a really good on ramp. Like I already knew Linus and Matt Wolf and like Heather Cooper and a bunch of these creators by then, Rowan Chuang. And that gave me a circle to transition to. And then we all help each other out as we're doing our versions of this creator journey. So, yeah, that was my like very long winded answer of like deciding to leave Google. And like maybe this is probably the most in depth version of that story that I've shared thus far.
And how you're doing the creator journey, I feel like is a bit more under the covers. It reminds me of Sahil Bloom, where people may not realize how many different agencies he's spun up, how many different things he has going. I feel like you aren't spinning the plates like everybody else. What are you focused on as a creator? You have a YouTube account with an enviable, 100x more subscribers than myself. I don't believe you have uploaded a video recently. What are you focused on as a creator, and how does that play out in terms of like the revenue you're earning?
That's a great question. And this is like the question I'm going into this winter with. And it's like at the end of the year, like last year, I wrote a strategy doc for myself, like every PM would, is like, here's like my strategy doc for like what I'm going to do this year. And basically, like I've got three dogs in me to set things up for people. There's the product builder in me that wants to build the machine inside the machine. I don't want to just use the machine. I want to build the goddamn machine with the people that like are worthy and are capable of building the machine. There's the creator in me, which is a lot of what you see on Twitter and LinkedIn, where it's like, hey, I'm in the sandbox. Lego pieces. Ooh, you can put them together in this cool combination. Hey, check this out. I'm not trying to be James Cameron. I'm not trying to make a cinematic masterpiece. I'm trying to put together primitives that otherwise people would not, and like essentially learn, some technology and share my interests interestingly. And then there's the evangelist. This is one I've been flexing a lot more with my collaboration with TED doing the podcast. And I just signed a deal with them to be their technology curator. So I'll be curating a bunch of their AI and tech talks at TED 2025 and TED Next, which is really exciting because like the goal for that is like really just that we're trying to put the T back into TED. Like, let's go not just be the place where you go and like X famous person announces their next book, but we want like the crazy Prone of Mystery, Sixth Sense type talks where like, crazy people coming up with crazy ideas, and that's the stage to show it on. But evangelism being more of like a God, it's like as a creator, you always go into plug mode. But as the evangelist, connecting the past to the present and the present to the future or the unknown and helping people come along for the ride. I feel like over the past year, I've really flexed, personality number 2 and 3, the creator and the evangelist. I haven't done as much product stuff. And it's interesting, like I tweeted about this earlier. Is like last year, the same thing happened end of last year, and this year, when like the headcount comes out at various the headcount opens up, people hit you up being like, yo, do you want to like just be an influencer, or do you want to be an operator building the future? And I always think about that, like in the sense that like, is there another way for me to scratch that product itch without doing a startup and without going and being, working at a big tech company? I don't have the answer yet, but that's one of my goals for next year. Because the way I've like dabbled in that is by scouting for A16Z, which I love doing, and angel investing in some startups. Like I got pre-seed on Pika, on Hedra, Backbone, and a couple other really Skyglass VFX that do amazing iPhone stuff. And then a couple other things that are coming out soon, including a defense tech one. Is like I can live vicariously through the founder, but it's only so much you can do, man, living vicariously through him. Like, oh, you got on a call once a month with the founder and you learned some things and you rattled off your whatever thing. This is maybe the origin of the VCs patting themselves on the back meme. It's like, I never want to return to that, even though I'm just a baby scout. I'm not even a VC, right? It's like, it's so like, that's not quite the right way to do it. Then what else is there? Well, the closest thing I found was as a part of my trying the monetization stack of creators, I taught 2 cohorts of a cohort-based course like every other AI creator on Maven. And I had an interesting takeaway from that I intend to double down next year, which is basically like I did 2 cohorts of this generative AI masterclass. The first cohort was a lot of like creative directors, like Hollywood people, visual artists that wanted to click by click on everything. Hey, let's get into comfy UI and like figure out how to do this in office hours. And then the second cohort ended up being this like product director from YouTube who just moved to the AI team, this other engineering director from Netflix, this group PM from Meta. And all of those folks came to it, like, and a couple other business owners that came to it with a mindset of like, hey, I want to get savvy about the tech, the primitives at my disposal, so that when all their like, PMs are advocating to put stuff on the roadmap, they have like a conceptual framework for how do I think about the opportunities with regards to audio, visual, 3D media in generative AI. And that was a lot more fun. I really enjoyed doing that. And it scratched that like stratechery itch in a more async way. So I'm thinking of building right now a brand that is distinct from myself, not Bilawal Sidhu. Working title is spatial intelligence. I need to make it better. something that's like encapsulates the future of creation and computing, and create more like just like deeper content that nobody would want to read otherwise, but is very hard to find in general. Cause there's like such few people that have actually done work on these intersections and actually shipped. This ends up being the thing that comes up again and again with the brands that I've worked with and the founders that I work with. They're like, yo, you're a creator, but you can level with me as a product builder. Cause sometimes like filmmakers who are using these tools are giving like advice, it's like not anchored in the practical realities of building real product, or even thinking about what does that mean for your growth mechanism, which obviously you know a lot about. And so I don't know, man, like I love doing the creator like mad science experiment thing. I'm gonna keep that going. That segues into a bunch of brand gigs, which I'll keep going. I've started doing speaking recently, which is great. The TED curation deal I'm excited about. But for that first bucket, I'm very excited to build some sort of a property that hopefully one day is as like, you know, like a force to be reckoned with, is like, let's say Stratechery meets Gartner meets Wired. Those are the things that pop into my head. I have no idea what it's going to look like. I've got an idea for a bunch of like minimum lovable content that I'm going to intend to produce. And in there, man, is a book too. That's the thing I keep getting pushed into, given like the circle comments like, oh, you have a podcast, you're going to be doing curation. Like, yo, you got to write a book. And I'm like, it's funny. I asked Andrew Chen about this. A16Z obviously wrote like a cold start problem. And he was basically like, if it was today, there's no way I'd write the book, but I would do it on Substack. So I've got an idea for sort of like a series that turns into a paywalled book alongside these modular pieces of content, 2 to 3 hours, where it's me using 2 or 3 different tools. Hey, here's how I like, you know, here's how you can create a video where like a spaceship crashed in your backyard and it walks through the 3 tools that you used to make it. Or here's how you can create a like world annotation app as a starting point where you can drop an anchor on anything in the world on the map and see it there when you get there, you know, in person. And just putting these modules out there as like a subscription service. Yeah, talking to Kajabi about doing it with them. Might do a self-hosted thing with Kajabi, but that's kind of where my head is. Too many brand gigs and I get a little too like I'm just shilling too much. Not enough brand gigs and I feel like, am I even a creator? And so like the evangelism stuff, I think between the podcast and now the curation stuff especially, I'm excited about, and Twitter and LinkedIn is great. But yeah, I want to focus on this other side. But you know, it's funny. I'll close by saying you mentioned this YouTube channel, which is true. My 2 biggest channels, Billy FX, like almost like a million on TikTok and like 400K on YouTube. They still keep getting 500,000 views. Like just it's racking 500,000 views. So that's been one reason I haven't touched it. But I keep asking myself, is there something else I should do with it? Like, is there like a world IP? I've occasionally had folks hit me up that are like ex agency world that are like trying to build, I hate to say it, but like the Pixar of AI or the AI studio of AI, whatever the meme is. They're like, yo, man, why don't we do what you're doing, but we'll put like a wrapper around it. It'll be like the back rooms. And I've thought about something like that. Like basically instead of the standalone shorts that you were talking about being in isolation, it building this world together that's interesting from a techno-futurism standpoint and pivoting it a little bit more towards like the pros and cons of like sort of essentially we're building the panopticon. All this mapping tech is the panopticon. And I think there's like a good, like if tech is mediating all interactions in the digital and the physical world, I think we need to equally share optimistic views, but also the cautionary tales. I think there's too much of like the cautionary stuff going on. So I do think about how to put that together. But hey, right now that's a P2 and that's my like my 4th bucket that I may not get to unless I have some like grand enlightenment over the holidays.
I feel like you're prioritizing your life so much better than the average creator. I mean, I think anybody in the world, if they were sitting on a 1 million TikTok account and 400,000 YouTube account, would be trying to pull
Milk
all the
it.
money out of it in the world. So how does your revenue break down today? You mentioned speaking, brand deals,
Yeah.
scouting, the podcast. How does it break down?
Yeah, I would say like if I stack the pyramid, the base of it is definitely speaking and brand gigs. That's the predominant way for creators to monetize. The next level up are the deals with TED, these type of long-term engagements. The next level up from that is like ad hoc stuff that I might do, like teaching a course, passive revenue from like YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, all that type of stuff. That's basically how I think about the stack. And honestly, it's like not complicated. I think the thing is like it's so easy for creators to go and get brand gigs if they wanted to. And you don't have to do like there are two ways to do that too. Is like the ones that I do is like where there's just like tremendous kind of brand alignment and the price is at a point where like it kind of makes my money's worth and I just need to put like a week or two into it. So for example, doing like a Lenovo or a Qualcomm engagement is a lot more satisfying for me, at least right now, than getting paid like a couple grand to like do a mid-roll ad spot in a newsletter. Now, if I was in a situation like you, some of my other creator friends, this is what I want to build out with spatial intelligence, where you've got a regular edition that goes out every week and you've got a lot more like a readership, um, then stacking enough of those like annual deals with brands can be a very lucrative business. I'm learning a lot from Rowan Chuang here, who's doing his newspaper. So he's just crushing it. And he focused to the point where like everyone's like, yo, we're gonna do podcasts. Like you're saying, like I'm focused. Dude, there are people way more focused than me. It's like, dude, like I'm gonna go do a podcast. I'll teach this course on the side. I'm gonna do a bunch of brand gigs. I'm also trying to be a creator in residence. Oh, by the way, I did that for 6 months at YouTube last year. That was a lot of fun to do. So these type of more opportunistic engagements. But Roland was like this, I'm just going to scale the newsletter. I think there's a lot to that. And so for that, for me, the last year has been Twitter and LinkedIn. That's the platform I put the most energy in. So what I'm hearing now from people, and I'm, again, like, I could be wrong. I'm like updating my map of the world is like, people are like, dude, no, your Substack should be way more valuable. You need to be building it out way, way more. And so I'm trying to think about how to create that like community hub that can kill a couple birds with one stone. And yeah, man, like the money's get to the point where like why ever do a traditional job unless you really get some super crazy like scope and yeah, barring getting an opportunity where somebody's like, I don't know, literally is like, yo, we need you to run like Meta Reality Lab or something like that. I don't think there's anything that would like excite me enough to go root for one team and just keep doing that. But I got a lot more to do on the monetization stack. Let me tell you that. It's like I'm just really happy and grateful that thanks to X and LinkedIn, I've had a bunch of organic inbound that's just like managed to make things work again and again. Yeah.
So 2024, almost in the books. If you were to compare that to year 5 at Google, which I think over those 5 years, the Google stock something like tripled. So your initial equity grants were pretty large golden handcuffs. How is the comparison?
Yeah. Well, let me tell you this also. I got a pretty fat retention offer in 2020, which, my comp was great. I would say like, I don't think I'm quite at that comp. I'm not going to hit that comp this year. Maybe like 200K off. I think next year I could definitely do it. And this is the other interesting thing is like last year, it's like, I made like 150K, this year I'm going to make like 400K. And so like, I've no doubt the next year I can make 700, 800, 900K. My goal is 1 million, but let's see if I get to that.
Amazing. Thank you so much for all of the insights you've shared. Personally, I have to say, just after this conversation, I feel like I have a different perspective on passion and finding passion in your work. So thanks for sharing a little bit of your passion with us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this valuable, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that really helps other listeners find out about the podcast. You can find all the past episodes or learn more about the show at product-growth.com. See you in the next episode.